Section 1. The show that refuses to die. There is a show on television right now that by every conventional rule of how this industry works should not exist anymore. It premiered in 1999 when the internet was still something most households accessed through a dial-up modem that screamed and groaned when it connected. When streaming was not a concept that anyone outside a small cluster of tech research laboratories had ever seriously entertained. When the idea that a canceled animated comedy could be resurrected by the power of its own fan base, acting through digital channels, would have sounded not just unlikely but genuinely science-fictional. It premiered when the world was different in almost every measurable way from the world it currently occupies, and it has continued across every major shift that the entertainment industry has experienced in the quarter century that followed. It has survived two cancellations. Not one, but two. Two separate occasions on which the people with the authority to end it looked at the numbers and made the decision that it was over, that the story had run its course, that the resources and the time slot and the production budget could be better used elsewhere. And both times, they were wrong. Both times, something outside the conventional logic of the television business intervened, something that the executives who made the cancellation decision had not accounted for, and perhaps could not have accounted for, given when and where they were standing and what they could see from there. It has survived two writers' strikes, the kind of industry-wide work stoppages that disrupt production schedules, scatter writing teams, and break the creative momentum of shows that were building towards something meaningful in their current season. The first strike hit during a period when the show was already navigating a creative transition, and when the disruption to the production rhythm made an already complicated situation more complicated still. The second strike, in 2023, hit in an era when the entire entertainment landscape had been transformed by streaming, when the stakes of writer compensation had expanded to include residuals from platforms that had not existed during the first strike, and that had become the primary venue through which most television was consumed. Both times, Family Guy was caught in the disruption. Both times it came through. It has survived the total collapse of the physical media market that was directly responsible for its second resurrection. The DVD industry that once moved 3 million copies of this specific show's early seasons, that once made purchasing a television DVD set a meaningful cultural act of loyalty and fandom, has essentially ceased to exist as a commercially significant force. The big box stores that once devoted entire wall sections to television DVD box sets have either closed or converted those sections to something else. The act of buying a physical copy of a television show has become antiquated in a way that makes the mechanism of Family Guy's revival sound like it belongs to a different civilization entirely, and yet the show it saved is still here. It has survived a complete corporate restructuring of the studio that makes it one of the largest and most consequential media acquisitions in history, the kind of corporate earthquake that reshuffles ownership of entire libraries of intellectual property, changes reporting structures, realigns revenue streams, and generally creates the kind of institutional uncertainty that can quietly end long-running shows simply by making nobody feel clearly responsible for protecting them. Disney's acquisition of most of 21st Century Fox's entertainment assets in 2019 moved Family Guy from one corporate universe into another, from the orbit of one of Hollywood's most established studios into the vast and carefully managed portfolio of the company that also owns Marvel and Lucasfilm and Genuine SAR, and the parks and resorts bearing the name of a man who has been dead for more than 50 years. Through all of that, the Griffin family survived. It has survived a bitter and publicly documented falling out between its creator and the network it airs on, the kind of talent network friction that in lesser cases ends with the creator departing and the show either dying or limping along without the animating intelligence that gave it its distinctive character. Seth MacFarlane, who created the show, voices its four most prominent characters and is in every meaningful sense the primary reason it exists, has been publicly and repeatedly candid about his frustrations with Fox as a corporate entity, specifically with the discomfort of having his creative work associated by proximity with political commentary that stands in direct opposition to his personal values. He has signed a $200 million development deal with NBC Universal that moved the center of gravity of his professional life firmly away from Fox. And yet the show he created continues to air on Fox, and he continues to voice its characters, because the mathematics of the situation make walking away from it economically irrational for everyone involved. It has survived a generational shift in how people consume entertainment so total and so rapid that the medium it was designed for, the 30-minute block of scheduled broadcast network television on a specific night of the week, has been reduced from the dominant form of entertainment consumption in American households to something closer to a specialized experience, maintained primarily by viewers who specifically prefer the communal dimension of watching something at the same time as everyone else. Every tidal shift in media consumption over the past 25 years, cord cutting, the smartphone revolution, streaming, TikTok, should have made a show built for the broadcast era of 1999 progressively less relevant and less commercially viable with each passing year. And yet, on a Wednesday night somewhere in America right now, or on a laptop screen in the glow of a bedroom at 2 in the morning, or on a phone held above someone's face while they drift toward the particular soft surrender of late night falling asleep, the Griffin family is there, still talking, still breathing, still somehow, inexplicably, alive. Family Guy has never been canceled again. And when you really sit with that sentence, when you let its full weight settle in your mind, the question that follows is not a small one and does not have an obvious answer. Because the story of why this show has never been canceled again is not the story most people think it is. It is not simply the story of loyal fans keeping something alive through love alone, though loyalty is genuinely part of it. It is not the story of a network finally doing right by a classic, though institutional lesson learning is genuinely part of it. And it is most certainly not the story of a show that kept getting better and better until nobody could possibly justify ending it. The real story is much stranger, and it reaches into corners of the television business that most people watching from their couches have never needed to think about. It is a story that requires understanding the economics of animation, and why animated shows are structurally more durable than their live-action counterparts in commercial environments that would kill a drama or a sitcom with identical audience numbers. It is a story about the streaming revolution not just as a cultural shift, but as a fundamental restructuring of which audience behaviors generate commercial value, a restructuring that turned Family Guy's specific structural characteristics into major assets after decades, during which those characteristics were barely visible to the people measuring television success. It is a story about corporate acquisitions and mutual dependencies, and the specific kind of institutional protection that comes from being embedded in multiple revenue streams owned by multiple parties whose interests align on keeping you alive. And woven through all of that, there is something else that gets lost in the most cynical versions of this story. Family Guy has also just quietly become one of the most watched programs in the entire history of streaming. In 2024, it was the third most streamed program in the United States across all platforms, accumulating 42.44 billion minutes of viewing time on Hulu. The audience did not disappear when the broadcast ratings fell. It migrated, it moved to a different place in a different time of day, and when it got there, it brought friends. Millions of them. So settle in. Let the room go quiet and soft around you, the light low, the night settling in around the edges of wherever you are right now. This is a story that deserves to be told slowly, with the care and attention that 25 years of improbable persistence have earned. We are going to start at the very beginning, with a young man at a drafting table in a Rhode Island art school, and follow this thing all the way forward to a corporate deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars that guarantees the Griffin family will be on your screen until at least the end of this decade. If you are watching this late at night or early in the morning, from wherever in the world you are settled right now, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment telling me the time and the place. And if this kind of deep, slow, story-driven content is what you come here for, please consider subscribing. It takes 1 second, and it means everything to a channel like this one. Now, let us begin. Section 2. Born from 2 short films and a dream, the origin of everything. To understand why Family Guy has never been canceled again, you first have to understand the very specific conditions under which it was created, because those conditions tell you something important about the kind of property it became and why that property proved so difficult to kill. Every show that achieves true longevity has something in its DNA from the very beginning some core quality or structural feature that makes it resilient in ways that its creators did not entirely plan for, and that only becomes visible in retrospect when you look back from a distance and ask what it was that this specific show had that so many of its contemporaries did not. Family Guy's resilience was baked in from the day a young animation student in Providence, Rhode Island, sat down at the beginning of his final academic year to make his senior thesis film. He had no idea, sitting at that drafting table, that he was beginning the process that would lead to one of the longest-running animated comedies in the history of American television. He was just a very talented 20-year-old trying to make something good enough to finish his degree. Seth MacFarlane grew up in Kent, Connecticut, a small New England town that seems designed by geography and culture to produce a certain type of introspective, deeply media-literate kid who spends too much time with old movies and too little time doing what other kids his age are doing. He was drawing and writing from childhood, producing cartoon strips for his local newspaper at the age of 9, the kind of prodigy-level evidence of a talent that has already found its medium and is waiting for the opportunity to develop it properly. By the time he enrolled at the Rhode Island School of Design in the early 1990s, the general shape of what he was going to do with his life was already clearly visible to anyone who looked carefully. The Rhode Island School of Design, known to everyone connected to it as RISD, is one of the most respected art and design institutions in the United States. It takes creative work with a seriousness that can feel almost severe to students who arrive expecting looseness, and it expects its students to develop not just technical skills but a genuine and distinct point of view, a perspective on the world that expresses itself through whatever medium they have chosen. MacFarlane had chosen animation, and he was good at it in the specific way that distinguishes the people who will eventually do something important in a field from the people who will always be competent but never transformative. His humor had a quality of genuine confidence about it, a sense that the jokes were coming from somewhere authentic rather than from an attempt to replicate what had already worked for someone else. There is an interesting biographical detail that speaks to his creative independence. MacFarlane has said that he originally intended to work for Walt Disney Animation, which dominated theatrical animated filmmaking throughout his formative years. But watching The Simpsons as a teenager changed something in his understanding of what animation could do. He saw that the medium could accommodate a kind of humor and a kind of commentary about American life that the traditional family entertainment model had never made room for, and he turned his professional ambitions accordingly. The Simpsons did not give him a template to imitate. It gave him a permission structure, a demonstration that adult animated comedy was possible and commercially viable and worth pursuing. In the academic year of 1994 to 1995, MacFarlane created his senior thesis film. He called it The Life of Larry. It ran about 11 minutes, and if you watch it today, which remains possible because it exists in the online archive of this kind of creative history, the experience is genuinely strange and illuminating. You are watching, unmistakably, the earliest visible form of what would eventually become Family Guy. There was a middle-aged, somewhat slovenly man named Larry Cummings, his patient wife Lois, his overweight teenage son Milt, and Larry's cynical, intelligent talking dog named Steve. The cutaway gag format was already there. The specific comic rhythm of the humor was already there. The voice MacFarlane gave to Larry, which he has described as being modeled on a security guard he once overheard talking at RISD, was recognizably the broad, slightly nasal New England working-class speech that would later define Peter Griffin for millions of viewers worldwide. The film also contained live-action segments in which MacFarlane himself addressed the camera directly, describing the characters and their world in a mock pitch to an imaginary television network. Even at 21, he was not just making animation. He was pitching. He was demonstrating an awareness of the commercial context in which his creative work would need to function that goes well beyond what most student films contain. What happened next was the kind of event that encourages young artists to believe the universe has a plan. MacFarlane's professor at RISD, recognizing what his student had created, submitted The Life of Larry to Hanna-Barbera, the storied animation studio behind everything from Yogi Bear to The Flintstones to Scooby-Doo. Hanna-Barbera looked at a 21-year-old's thesis film and offered him a job. MacFarlane moved to Los Angeles and began working as a writer and animator on shows including Dexter's Laboratory, Johnny Bravo, and Cow and Chicken. These were not glamorous positions in the Hollywood hierarchy, but they were enormously valuable, giving him direct contact with the working mechanics of television animation production from the inside, the schedules and the budgets and the writing processes, and the institutional dynamics between creators and networks that would become the entire landscape of his professional life for the next 3 decades. During his time at Hanna-Barbera, which had by then become Cartoon Network Studios, he created a follow-up to The Life of Larry called Larry and Steve. It focused on the two most compelling characters from the original, pushing their dynamic further and funnier, and it aired as part of Cartoon Network's What a Cartoon Showcase in 1997, a programming slot designed to give new short-form animated content a proving ground. The short attracted the attention of executives at the Fox Broadcasting Company, who invited MacFarlane to a meeting, gave him approximately $40,000 to develop a longer pilot, and then watched what he came back with. By his own account, MacFarlane spent approximately 6 months drawing with an intensity that excluded almost everything else in his life, filling page after page in his kitchen, barely sleeping, building the world that Larry and Steve would eventually become. He came back to Fox with a completed pilot. The network ordered 13 episodes and offered him a $2.5 million per season production deal. MacFarlane was 24 years old, about to become the youngest person in American television history to create and run an animated primetime series on a major broadcast network. The world he had built was called Family Guy, a title that is both entirely generic and somehow exactly right, describing its subject without specifying its tone and leaving enough room for everything the show would eventually become. The setting was a fictional town in Rhode Island. The Griffins were its central family. Peter, still recognizably Larry from the Thesis film, was expanded and sharpened into a specific kind of American everyman, a blue-collar worker at a toy factory and later a brewery, someone who loved his family imperfectly and bumbled through life with more goodwill than judgment. Lois was his wife, a stay-at-home mother from a wealthy family who had chosen a domestic life and spent her considerable intelligence keeping her household from complete collapse. Meg was the eldest teenager, permanently on the outside of the social world she wanted desperately to join. Chris was the middle child, gentle and confused, and dreamy in equal measure. Stewie, the baby, wore a tiny yellow shirt and a football-shaped head and harbored ambitions of world domination and matricide. And Brian was the family dog, walking on 2 legs and drinking martinis, and serving as the most coherent and most recognizable human presence in a household that needed one badly. The show premiered on the 31st of January, 1999, immediately following Fox's broadcast of Super Bowl 33, in one of the most coveted programming positions in American television. 22 million people watched that first episode. It was an extraordinary debut for an extraordinary piece of creative work, and what happened in the years that immediately followed it is one of the stranger and more consequential stories in the history of American broadcast television. Section 3. The First Cancellation. How Fox Killed Its Own Golden Goose. The story of Family Guy's first cancellation is, at its deepest level, not really a story about the show at all. It is a story about the structural dysfunction of network television scheduling in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and about the particular brand of impatient, self-defeating decision-making that the major broadcast networks have demonstrated throughout their history when confronted with shows that do not immediately perform at peak levels in every environment they are placed in. Fox did not cancel Family Guy because it was bad. It canceled Family Guy because it could not figure out where to put it, and did not have the institutional patience to let something build the audience it needed to build at the pace that audience building actually takes. When Family Guy launched in January of 1999, it had something it would never consistently have again during its original run, a good home. Following The Simpsons on Sunday nights, sandwiched in a programming flow that made intuitive, creative, and commercial sense, the show settled in and performed with quiet respectability. Its first full season averaged 12.8 million households per episode, good enough to rank it at number 33 in the annual Nielsen ratings. For a first-time showrunner's first season on a network that had spent the better part of a decade trying and failing to build another successful animated comedy in the shadow of The Simpsons, those numbers were genuinely solid. They were the numbers of a show that was finding its audience and building its foundation, doing exactly what a new show in a stable environment should do, and then Fox moved it. When the second season launched in September of 1999, the show was transplanted to Thursday nights at 9 in the evening, directly opposite NBC's Frasier. This was not a competitive scheduling decision. It was institutional sacrifice dressed up as strategy. NBC's Thursday night block in the late 1990s was not merely popular programming. It was a cultural institution, the specific anchor point around which tens of millions of Americans organized their weekly television habits. The must-see TV branding was not hyperbole. Thursday nights on NBC had built a loyalty and a habit in the American household that was decades in the making, and that no new show from any network could reasonably be expected to displace simply by showing up. Frasier was surrounded by ER and the final seasons of Seinfeld and later the decade-long phenomenon of Friends, and placing Family Guy in that environment was placing it in the path of a force it could not withstand. The ratings collapsed, as they inevitably would. Fox responded by moving the show again, this time to Tuesday nights where it faced ABC's Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, which in the winter of 1999 and 2000 was the single most watched program in American television, drawing audiences of 20 to 30 million viewers per episode, with a competition format that had the specific appeal of being simple enough for anyone to watch and dramatic enough to produce genuine suspense. The combination of a simple premise and enormous stakes, the possibility of winning $1 million by answering questions, had made the show a genuinely unprecedented ratings phenomenon in an era when most television executives believed they had already seen everything the medium was capable of producing. Family Guy, placed opposite both of these immovable forces in succession, fell in the ratings in ways that the show's inherent quality was powerless to prevent. By May of 2000, Fox canceled it, announcing at the annual upfront presentation to advertisers that the show would not be returning for a third season. And then, in an act of institutional confusion that turned out to be one of the more consequential accidents in the history of television, Fox changed its mind 2 months later and ordered 13 additional episodes. Not because anyone had become a passionate defender of the show's creative quality, because there was a scheduling gap that needed filling and the show was ready to fill it. The third season launched in November of 2001, after a production gap that had stretched longer than intended, and that was further extended by the events of September 11th, which disrupted the production schedules of shows across the industry in ways that are often overlooked when this period is discussed through the narrow lens of ratings competition. When the third season arrived, it found itself on Thursday nights again, this time facing both Friends, the most culturally dominant American sitcom of its era, and the early seasons of Survivor, the reality competition format that had arrived in 2000 and immediately demonstrated an appetite for scheduled shared viewing that the broadcast networks had not seen since the early days of television. The audience could not find the show reliably because Fox was programming it inconsistently, airing episodes irregularly with long gaps and little promotional support. The writing staff, sensing that the show's survival was genuinely uncertain, produced some strong individual episodes but could not maintain the momentum and coherence that a stable creative environment produces. When Fox canceled the show for the second time in May of 2002, the announcement came without any subsequent reversal. The production shut down, the writing team dispersed. The unaired episodes sat in a vault, and the rights to the existing episodes, 3 seasons of genuinely creative television that had been treated with remarkable institutional carelessness, went to the first buyer willing to pay almost nothing for them. That buyer was the Cartoon Network, filling the late-night Adult Swim block with content that nobody expected to matter. And in that low-stakes, poorly lit corner of the cable television landscape, something began to happen that nobody in the offices where the cancellation decisions had been made could have predicted or prepared for. Section 4. Adult Swim, DVD sales, and the resurrection nobody saw coming. The Adult Swim block on Cartoon Network in the early 2000s occupied a specific niche that nobody had consciously designed, one that emerged from the particular combination of a network that needed late-night content and a creative team that wanted to make animation for adults without the constraints that governed what could appear before a certain hour. Adult Swim had built an identity around shows that were weird and smart and occasionally brilliant in the way that things made with genuine creative freedom tend to be. Programs like Aqua Teen Hunger Force and Space Ghost, Coast to Coast, that existed in a register of comedy the major networks had no mechanism for and no interest in accommodating. It had developed a devoted late-night audience, the specific demographic of people who are awake at midnight on a weeknight, not because they have somewhere to be, but because the quiet of late night suits them better than the organized social demands of daytime. When Family Guy arrived on Adult Swim in April of 2003, the network gave it something it had never consistently received during its Fox run: a stable, predictable schedule. The same time slot on the same nights, repeated consistently enough that the audience could form the habit of showing up at a specific time, expecting the show to be there. The show averaged around 9 million viewers per episode in those late-night hours, a figure that placed it at the top of the Adult Swim block immediately, and that was, in the context of late-night cable television, extraordinary. The show that had been unable to survive the competitive primetime broadcast environment was thriving in the low-stakes, high-loyalty environment of late-night cable, where the competition was not Frasier or Friends, but the specific absence of anything else that late-night viewers with particular tastes wanted to watch. The viewers who came to Family Guy on Adult Swim included people who had watched the show during its original Fox run, and who had felt the specific frustration of losing something they loved to the institutional indifference of a network that never seemed to understand what it had. But they also included new viewers who had not found the show during its broadcast life, people who discovered it in the Adult Swim environment and encountered it fresh, without the accumulated disappointment of the scheduling wars. For these new viewers, the show was simply funny and strange and original, a voice they had not heard before doing things they had not seen done before, and they became fans with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of people encountering something for the first time. But the Adult Swim ratings, remarkable as they were only half of the story of what made 2003 such a decisive turning point. The other half was happening in a market that the entertainment industry was still in the earliest stages of understanding, one that had developed faster than anyone had anticipated, and that was producing commercial signals that the existing measurement tools were poorly equipped to interpret. DVD sets of complete television seasons had been a commercial product for only a few years in 2003. The format had standardized, the technology had matured, and a handful of early releases had demonstrated that there was genuine consumer interest in owning physical copies of favorite television programs. But nobody had yet seen what the format could produce when the circumstances were precisely right. When a beloved show had been off the air long enough for its absence to be genuinely felt, when the audience that loved it had been looking for any way to maintain their relationship with it during the years it was unavailable, and when the physical release coincided with the show's reemergence in a new venue that was simultaneously introducing it to new viewers who had never encountered it before. The first and second season DVD sets of Family Guy were released in the same week that the Adult Swim reruns launched in April of 2003. The simultaneous release of both products created a feedback loop of discovery and enthusiasm that amplified each product's reach. People who discovered the show on Adult Swim went looking for more of it and found the DVD sets. People who bought the DVD sets told other people about them, and those people went to Adult Swim to sample the show for free before deciding whether to purchase. Within 1 month of the release date, 400,000 copies had been sold. By the end of 2003, cumulative sales had reached 2.5 million copies. The Family Guy DVD sets were the best-selling television DVD product of 2003 and the second best-selling television DVD sets in the history of the format, trailing only the first season of Comedy Central's Chappelle's Show. Fox was watching these numbers with the specific attention of an institution that had made an expensive mistake and was beginning to understand the nature of that mistake. By the time the decision to order new episodes was formalized in 2004, DVD sales had crossed 3 million copies. 3 million people had purchased physical copies of a show that had been canceled twice and that was not currently producing new content. 3 million purchasing decisions, each representing a deliberate act of economic commitment to something that had no current commercial presence beyond the reruns and the physical product itself. This was not the passive viewership of people watching whatever happened to be on. This was active, intentional, financially expressed loyalty of a kind that the standard metrics of broadcast television had no mechanism for capturing or interpreting. Family Guy became the first television series in American history to be revived primarily on the strength of its performance in ancillary commercial markets rather than its broadcast ratings. The precedent it established has shaped the entertainment industry's approach to audience measurement and renewal decisions in every year since. Every subsequent case of a canceled show being revived based on streaming performance, on social media engagement, on any form of evidence other than overnight broadcast ratings, has a direct ancestor in what happened with Family Guy in 2003. The show did not just survive its cancellation. It changed the terms on which the television industry understands what constitutes commercial viability. Fox ordered a fourth season in 2004. It was scheduled to premiere in May of 2005, 3 years after the second cancellation. The fourth season premiere drew 11.85 million viewers, the largest audience the show had attracted outside of the Super Bowl night launch, evidence that 3 years of absence had created a specific hunger in the audience, that the Adult Swim reruns and the DVD sets had maintained and focused rather than satisfied. The fans had come back. They had brought new viewers with them, and the show was about to begin the phase of its existence in which it would never be canceled again, a phase whose mechanics and whose logic it is now time to examine in their full complexity and their full commercial significance. Section 5. The second cancellation and the second coming. What the pattern reveals? Let us pause here and look at the pattern carefully, because the pattern reveals something that gets overlooked in most accounts of this story. Family Guy was canceled twice, and both times it came back. The first cancellation was reversed within 2 months by a network that had a programming gap it needed to fill. The second cancellation led, after 3 years, to a full and triumphant revival, driven by the commercial evidence of audience loyalty expressed in ways that the industry had not previously seen and did not have the tools to measure adequately. The pattern reveals a crucial distinction: the difference between a show that is canceled because it has exhausted its creative possibilities and a show that is canceled because the people responsible for protecting it did not do so effectively. Family Guy was never canceled because it ran out of things to say or stories to tell. It was canceled because it was placed in bad time slots against overwhelming competition, and because the broadcast television industry of that era did not have either the patience or the analytical tools to distinguish between a show that was failing because of its own limitations and a show that was being failed by the system supposed to support it. That distinction is enormous, and the fact that it went unrecognized for as long as it did says something important about the specific blindness that afflicted the major broadcast networks in the years before the internet made audience loyalty visible in ways that extended beyond the scheduled viewing habits the Nielsen system was designed to measure. The show that returned in 2005 was recognizably the same show that had left in 2002 but was not exactly identical. 3 years is a meaningful period in the life of any creative project. The writing staff had dispersed and then partially reassembled, with some original voices returning and some new voices adding their sensibilities to the mix. MacFarlane had spent the interval developing American Dad, which gave him the opportunity to make deliberate structural decisions that differentiated the second show from the first, including most notably the decision to forego the cutaway gag format entirely in favor of story-driven episode structures. American Dad's commitment to conventional narrative would prove consequential for that show's subsequent reputation and would eventually lead many observers to conclude that it had become a better show than the one it was, originally dismissed as imitating. Family Guy retained its cutaway identity on its return, and the returning seasons showed at their best a sharpened confidence in what the show was and what it was for. The voice cast came back with the specific kind of renewed energy that comes from knowing that a second chance is not guaranteed and should not be wasted. The network environment of 2005 was meaningfully different from the one that had twice canceled the show. The animation domination block on Fox's Sunday nights, placing Family Guy alongside The Simpsons, King of the Hill, and The New American Dad in a coherent programming unit, gave the show something it had never had in its original run: a stable, consistent home with a ready-made flow of animation-minded viewers from one show to the next. Ratings for the return show were strong and sustained in a way that the original run had never been able to sustain. Season 4 averaged around 7.9 million viewers, substantially more than the show had consistently attracted during its troubled first 3 seasons, and the performance held through seasons 5, 6, and 7 well enough that the renewal decisions came without the existential uncertainty that had characterized every phase of the show's original broadcast life. For the first time, Family Guy was being treated by its network as an asset to be protected and developed, rather than as a problem to be managed. This is the deeper significance of the second cancellation in the story of the show's permanent survival. The revival did not just save Family Guy. It transformed the relationship between the show and its institutional stewards from one of uncertain guardianship to something closer to committed protection. When you have canceled something twice and watched it demonstrate its commercial value in the absence of your support with more clarity and more financial persuasiveness than it was able to demonstrate with your support, you have received a lesson expensive enough to actually change behavior. Fox learned that canceling Family Guy had costs that were not immediately visible in the ratings reports and that only became fully apparent when the show was gone and its audience demonstrated the depth of its loyalty through the unconventional channels of late-night cable viewership and physical media purchasing. The lesson stuck, and the sticking of the lesson is the foundation on which everything else in this story was built. Without the experience of the cancellations and the specific quality of the revival they enabled, the show would not have developed the particular kind of fan relationship that has sustained it through every subsequent challenge. Without the DVD phenomenon and the Adult Swim triumph and the evidence of loyalty they provided, the network might not have committed to the stable scheduling that allowed the show to build and maintain its post-revival audience. Without that audience, the streaming performance that now anchors the show's commercial case for renewal would not exist in the form it currently takes. The two cancellations and the two revivals form a causal chain whose end is the show's current state of near-permanent institutional protection. It is a strange way for that protection to have been established, through failure rather than success, through absence rather than presence, through the audience's demonstration of loyalty under conditions of deprivation rather than abundance. But the entertainment industry has always worked this way, producing its most durable commercial relationships from the most unlikely circumstances, creating the conditions for permanence through exactly the kind of near-death experience that Family Guy endured twice in its first few years. The commercial logic that now protects the show is worth examining in detail because it is the engine that drives every renewal decision and that makes the prospect of a third cancellation essentially inconceivable to everyone with a financial stake in the show's continued existence. That logic begins with the economics of animation, which are fundamentally different from the economics of any other form of primetime television production, and which create conditions under which even a show with declining broadcast ratings can remain enormously profitable and enormously worth keeping alive. Section 6. The Economics of Animation. Why cartoons are nearly impossible to kill. There is a specific mathematics that applies to animated television shows that does not apply to any other form of primetime programming, and understanding that mathematics is essential to understanding why Family Guy has never been canceled again and why it will continue to exist for as long as the commercial conditions that sustain it remain stable. It is a mathematics that has protected The Simpsons through more than 3.5 decades, that has kept South Park in production long past the point where any live-action show with comparable broadcast ratings would have been quietly retired, and that has made Family Guy a show renewed by cold commercial logic rather than institutional affection or creative enthusiasm. Start with the cost. Producing one episode of Family Guy costs approximately $2 million. That figure has been widely reported across the industry press and is broadly consistent with what production insiders have described when discussing the show's economics. $2 million per episode sounds significant in the abstract, and in absolute terms it is real money. But it is a remarkably small number when placed alongside the cost of producing the other kinds of programming that compete for the same broadcast time slots and advertising revenues. A single episode of a prestige live-action drama in the contemporary landscape typically costs between $5 million and $15 million to produce, a range determined by the specific combination of cast compensation, location logistics, production design ambition, visual effects requirements, and the overall scale of the production enterprise. A network situation comedy with a recognizable cast runs between $3 million and $5 million per episode. Even the most modestly budgeted live-action show involves expense categories that animation simply does not have to contend with. Locations must be found, secured, legally cleared, and prepared for filming. Physical sets must be constructed or rented. Wardrobe and makeup departments must be assembled and staffed. Camera equipment, lighting rigs, and sound recording apparatus must be rented and operated. And the people who appear on screen, whose faces are the show's primary commercial asset, and whose compensation reflects both their individual market value and the collective leverage of a well-organized talent union, are expensive in ways that have no precise equivalent in animation. Voice actors, even the best compensated ones at the top of their field, earn substantially less per episode than on-screen performers of equivalent cultural prominence. The core Family Guy cast secured contracts in 2013 that paid between $175,000 and $225,000 per episode each, a compensation level that reflects the show's commercial success and the cast's well-earned leverage in negotiation. But the star performers of top live-action network comedies and dramas in the same period were regularly earning $500,000 to $1 million per episode. The structural cost advantage that animation provides through its voice-based performance model is not marginal. It is transformative in its implications for the show's commercial sustainability. The animation production work itself is handled primarily by overseas studios, a practice that has been standard in American television animation since the industry developed its current structure in the 1960s and 1970s, when the economics of producing content for Saturday morning television made domestic production at scale commercially impossible. Family Guy's animation has moved through multiple studios over its run, including Rough Draft Studios in Los Angeles and South Korea, Digital E-Mation in South Korea, and other international facilities whose lower labor costs make possible the production of high-quality animation at price points that comparable domestic production could not achieve. The process requires detailed storyboards and layout work to be prepared by the American creative team and then sent overseas for animation, with the completed work returning for post-production and finalization in Los Angeles. What this means in practical terms is that a full season of Family Guy at $2 million per episode costs between $30 and $45 million to produce, depending on episode count. A comparable live-action show of equivalent cultural profile would cost somewhere between $100 and $300 million for the same number of episodes. The difference in production cost changes the fundamental commercial calculation for every renewal decision. The lower the production cost, the lower the revenue threshold that must be crossed to make renewal economically rational. The lower that threshold, the more resilient the show is against declines in any single revenue stream. Broadcast ratings can fall substantially, and the show can still be commercially viable because the math is being done at a scale where the fixed costs are low enough that even a reduced revenue picture produces a positive outcome. And the revenue picture for Family Guy is not simply its broadcast advertising. Not even primarily its broadcast advertising, at this stage in the show's life. The revenue structure of a show with this kind of history and this kind of commercial footprint is layered across multiple streams, each contributing meaningfully to the total, each operating with a degree of independence from the others that provides commercial resilience against the performance fluctuations of any individual component. There are the syndication deals, through which the show's library of episodes is licensed to cable networks and streaming services in exchange for fees that have historically been reported at $2 million per episode, producing a total syndication revenue that has been estimated at more than $400 million across the show's run, before accounting for more recent arrangements. There are the streaming licensing deals, primarily with Hulu, which holds exclusive domestic streaming rights to the show in the United States, and which pays licensing fees that, while not publicly disclosed, are understood by industry observers to be substantial given the show's extraordinary streaming performance. There is the international licensing, through which the show is distributed to broadcasters and streaming services in more than 100 countries, generating revenue streams that aggregate into something significant and that function largely independently of the show's domestic broadcast performance. And there is the merchandise and licensing ecosystem, the products bearing the show's characters and imagery sold through tens of thousands of retail outlets globally, which has historically contributed hundreds of millions of dollars to the franchise's total commercial value. Together, these revenue streams create a show that generates substantial and relatively stable income for its corporate owner, regardless of whether 2 million or 10 million people are watching new episodes on a given broadcast night. The broadcast ratings, which are the commercial metric most visible to the general public and most frequently discussed in the trade press coverage of the show's performance, are in fact the most volatile and the most easily affected by external competitive factors component of the total revenue picture. Everything else is comparatively stable, comparatively predictable, and comparatively disconnected from the week-to-week fluctuations of the linear television audience. This structural reality is the most fundamental reason why Family Guy has never been canceled again. It is not expensive enough, relative to what it earns across all its commercial dimensions, for its cancellation to make financial sense. And as the broadcast ratings have declined over the years, this logic has only become more rather than less compelling. Because the production costs have not changed proportionally to the audience decline, and because the non-broadcast revenue streams have not declined proportionally either, meaning that the show's overall commercial performance has been more resilient than its broadcast numbers alone would suggest. There is also the question of what cancellation actually costs, a question that rarely gets adequate attention in discussions of why shows get canceled, but that is genuinely consequential in evaluating the decision. Cancellation creates holes in programming schedules that must be filled with development investments in new shows, most of which will fail, and none of which will immediately generate the syndication and streaming revenue that the canceled show was producing. It ends the commercial relationships with merchandise licensees who have built product lines around the canceled property and who will not maintain those lines indefinitely if no new content is forthcoming. It disrupts the viewing habits of the audience for the show's programming block, neighbors, who have organized their viewing around the canceled show's presence and whose habits may not automatically transfer to a replacement. And in the specific case of Family Guy, it would begin the process of deflating an entire commercial ecosystem that has been built over more than 2 decades and that generates substantial ongoing revenue for the corporate entities that benefit from its continued operation. Cancellation has a cost. For a show with Family Guy's economics, that cost has consistently exceeded the benefit, and it will continue to exceed the benefit for as long as the commercial fundamentals that currently sustain the show remain in place. Section 7. The Streaming Revolution and Family Guy's Hidden Digital Empire. There is a number that reframes everything else in this story, that makes the declining broadcast ratings and the critical assessments of the show's later seasons and the conventional narrative of gradual irrelevance seem not just wrong but almost completely beside the point. The number is 42.44 billion. That is the number of minutes that American viewers spent watching Family Guy on Hulu in the single calendar year of 2024, according to Nielsen's annual streaming measurement report. 42 billion minutes. To hold that number in human-scaled terms for a moment, it is the equivalent of approximately 80,000 years of continuous viewing, accumulated by real people making real choices about what to watch from an essentially unlimited menu of available entertainment options. In 2024, according to those same Nielsen measurements, Family Guy was the third most streamed program in the United States across all platforms for the entire year. Not the third most streamed in its genre, not the third most streamed among animated shows, the third most streamed program overall, behind only Bluey on Disney Plus and Grey's Anatomy across Hulu and Netflix. Family Guy, with its presence on a single streaming platform, accumulated more viewing time than every original Netflix drama combined, more than every Amazon Prime Video series, more than almost any other piece of content that appeared on a streaming-capable screen in an American household for the entire 12-month period. In 2025, the performance continued at a comparable scale. Nielsen presented Seth MacFarlane with the inaugural Streaming Icon of the Year award, noting that his complete catalog of television series and films had generated over 60 billion viewing minutes across streaming platforms in that single year. Family Guy specifically ranked as the 7th most streamed program overall and the 2nd most watched adult animation title. The show appeared on Nielsen's weekly streaming top 10 chart for 37 consecutive weeks in 2025, a streak that reflects deep, habitual audience engagement rather than the spike and collapse pattern that characterizes shows whose viewership is driven by novelty and promotional investment. These numbers require a genuine reorientation of perspective to absorb fully because they are inconsistent with the prevailing cultural narrative about Family Guy as a show in commercial and creative decline. The prevailing narrative is not wrong in every respect. The broadcast ratings are substantially lower than they were at the show's peak, The critical consensus on the recent seasons is less enthusiastic than the consensus on the early ones. The show does not dominate the cultural conversation in the way it did during its first decade. All of that is true. But the streaming numbers demonstrate that the audience for this show, the total number of people spending real time engaged with its content, is not declining. It is, in certain respects, larger than it has ever been, distributed across a different consumption pattern than the one that broadcast ratings measure, but no less real or commercially significant for that difference. The explanation for the streaming performance lies in the structural characteristics of the show and in the specific dynamics of the streaming consumption model, which rewards different things than the broadcast model and which creates different kinds of commercial value from different kinds of audience behavior. Streaming measures total viewing time accumulated across all episodes at all hours by all viewers, regardless of when they watch or how many times they have watched the same episodes before. A viewer who has seen every episode of Family Guy and returns to specific favorites when they want comfort viewing contributes to the streaming numbers. A viewer who is discovering the show for the first time and watching multiple seasons in rapid succession contributes differently but substantially. A viewer who watches 1 or 2 episodes per week as a background activity, half paying attention while doing something else, contributes in a way that was entirely invisible to the broadcast rating system, but that is completely captured by streaming measurement. The show's specific structural characteristics make it exceptionally well suited to the streaming consumption model in ways that more narratively complex or more emotionally demanding shows are not. It has a large back catalog of more than 400 episodes, each approximately 22 minutes long, each self-contained and accessible without requiring the viewer to have watched prior episodes. There is no wrong place to start. There is no requirement to watch in order, no serialized narrative that rewards the patient viewer who begins at the beginning and proceeds chronologically, but punishes the casual viewer who joins in the middle. The episodic, anthology-adjacent structure that was sometimes criticized as a limitation of the show's storytelling ambition turns out to be a precise structural match for the browsing, low-commitment viewing mode that streaming audiences have come to prefer. The comfort viewing dimension of the show's streaming success is worth examining at some length, because it is one of the defining phenomena of the streaming era, and one that the entertainment industry has spent years struggling to understand and account for in its commercial planning. The assumption that drove the streaming revolution was that platforms would compete primarily through original programming, through ambitious and distinctive new content that justified subscription fees and generated critical attention and cultural conversation. Original programming has certainly mattered. But the shows that have consistently driven the most actual viewing time on streaming platforms, year after year, have very often been library titles, older programs that people already know and have already formed relationships with, and return to repeatedly with the specific pleasure of revisiting the familiar. Family Guy is, for the generation that grew up watching it, the television equivalent of a comfort food, something you turn on when you want to be in a space you know well, without having to do the emotional or cognitive work of engaging with something new. The show's familiar characters, its predictable but amusing rhythms, its ability to be genuinely entertaining even when watched with partial attention, all of these qualities make it ideally suited to the kind of background viewing, falling asleep, doing something else while watching mode that is perhaps the most common form of streaming consumption, and that the Nielsen numbers, measuring total minutes rather than complete attention, capture fully. The streaming performance numbers also have a direct and significant relationship to the show's corporate position within the Disney ecosystem. Hulu, where the show streams exclusively in the domestic market, is majority owned by Disney. Family Guy is produced by 20th Television Animation, which is a Disney subsidiary. So every minute of Family Guy viewing on Hulu generates advertising revenue and subscriber retention value that flows, through multiple pathways, back to the same corporate parent that owns the production company making the show. The vertical integration of the show's commercial ecosystem within the Disney structure means that the streaming performance directly and substantially benefits the corporation that controls the show's production and the renewal, decisions that determine whether new episodes continue to be made. In the week of August 26 through the 1st of September 2024, Family Guy accumulated more than 1 billion minutes of viewing time on Hulu, securing the third most streamed series position for that week overall. In multiple surrounding weeks, it ranked among the 5 most streamed shows across all platforms. These are not the numbers of a niche legacy property surviving on the goodwill of a shrinking base of nostalgic older viewers. They are the numbers of a show that has found, in the streaming environment, a form of commercial relevance that its broadcast performance never fully captured, and that makes its corporate case for continued existence more compelling in 2026 than it was at any point during its original broadcast run. Section 8. The Merchandise Machine and Licensing Gold. Pull back from the screen for a moment and try to imagine the full commercial footprint of Family Guy not as a television show but as an intellectual property. A set of characters and a world and a specific comedic vocabulary that exists independently of any particular episode or season and that generates commercial value across dozens of different markets and product categories. Simultaneously, at the center of this map is the show itself, the episodes being produced and broadcast and streamed, the creative work that is the reason everything else on the map exists. But radiating outward from that center are revenue streams that most viewers have never thought about and that collectively constitute a commercial operation of significant scale. The franchise has been valued at approximately $2 to $2.5 billion in total, a figure that encompasses the broadcast advertising, the streaming licensing fees, the syndication arrangements, the international distribution deals, and the merchandise and licensing programs that have been running continuously since the show established its commercial footing in the mid-2000s. The merchandise component alone has historically represented hundreds of millions of dollars in contribution to the total, and it operates with a commercial logic that is distinct from and complementary to the show's media revenues. Fast Company's detailed analysis of Family Guy's commercial economics documented the scale of the licensing operation with specific precision. More than 500 distinct products had been licensed to approximately 10,000 retail outlets, including Target, Walmart, and Kmart. The range of these products extends from the entirely expected clothing and mugs and phone cases and posters to the genuinely surprising, a Family Guy edition of Monopoly, Family Guy Uno, a Family Guy pinball machine that appeared in arcades and game rooms during the peak years of the show's cultural dominance, multiple video game releases across console and mobile platforms, a series of limited edition beers produced by real breweries under licensing arrangements that connected the fictional Pawtucket Patriot Ale Brewery from the show to actual consumer products in the craft beer market, targeting precisely the adult male demographic that the show's humor has always spoken to most directly. The video game dimension of the licensing program deserves specific attention because of the particular commercial mechanism it creates. Physical games and console releases generate one-time purchase revenue and maintain the intellectual property's presence in households for as long as the games remain playable. But the mobile game Family Guy, The Quest for Stuff, the freemium iOS and Android game developed by TinyCo and released in 2014, operates on a different and more commercially sophisticated model. The game has been continuously updated with new content tied to current episodes, holiday events, and seasonal themes for more than a decade. It creates a daily engagement habit for its users, a regular appointment with the Family Guy world that keeps the show's characters and settings in the player's daily mental life, and that generates continuous revenue through in-app purchases. Players who check in with the Quest for Stuff every day are not just customers. They are participants in an ongoing relationship with the intellectual property that functions simultaneously as a revenue source and as a retention mechanism, reinforcing their affection for the show itself. The TikTok ecosystem that has organically developed around Family Guy clips represents a form of commercial presence that is technically outside the formal licensing structure, but that contributes to the show's overall commercial health in ways that the studios have recognized and chosen to accommodate. The show's cutaway gag format produces self-contained comic moments that are structurally perfect for short-form video platforms. They are brief, they are funny without requiring context, and they have a setup and a punchline that fit entirely within the 15 to 60-second duration that TikTok's interface rewards. The hashtag for the show has accumulated tens of billions of views across the platform. Individual clip channels post brief moments from the show's catalog of 400-plus episodes and accumulate millions of followers by doing so. The studios have broadly tolerated the copyright gray area this creates because the commercial benefit of the organic promotion substantially outweighs the theoretical revenue loss from the unauthorized use. A person who encounters a Family Guy clip on TikTok, finds it funny, and then opens Hulu to watch more of the show has been acquired as a streaming viewer at zero cost to the production. That viewer's subsequent streaming activity contributes to the viewership numbers that justify Hulu's licensing fees, which contribute to the commercial calculation that supports continued production. The informal clip economy is not separate from the show's commercial ecosystem. It is one of the mechanisms through which that ecosystem perpetuates and expands itself. The international merchandise market adds a further dimension to the licensing program's commercial significance. Products bearing Family Guy characters are sold not just in American retail but in markets across Europe, Latin America, Asia Pacific, and the Middle East, wherever the show has established the kind of cultural recognition that makes branded merchandise commercially viable. The global reach of the intellectual property, established through decades of international broadcasting and expanded through the global availability of streaming services, means that the merchandise and licensing revenue base is genuinely international in scope and is growing in markets where streaming expansion is bringing the show to new audiences for the first time. The interconnection between all of these commercial activities, the broadcasting and the streaming and the merchandise and the games and the clip economy, creates a self-reinforcing ecosystem in which the success of each component contributes to the success of the others. New episodes generate new clips for TikTok and new content updates for the mobile game. The mobile game keeps players engaged with the intellectual property between episodes. The TikTok clips introduce new viewers who become streaming subscribers. The streaming subscribers contribute to the licensing fees that fund the production of new episodes. The cycle sustains itself, and the commercial case for continued production sits at the center of it, reinforced from every direction. Section 9. The cast, the contracts, and the loyalty loop. One of the genuinely underappreciated structural factors in Family Guy's unbroken continuity since its 2005 revival is the extraordinary stability of its core voice cast, a stability that is unusual in long-running television shows of any kind, and that has played a meaningful and often overlooked role in both the show's commercial consistency and its cultural coherence across more than 20 seasons of continuous new episode production. In an industry defined by contract negotiations that break down, by actors who leave to pursue other opportunities, by the physical and professional realities that make it impossible to maintain any single ensemble intact across a quarter century, Family Guy has kept its foundational voices in place without interruption, and that continuity has been both a commercial asset and a creative one. Consider what it means for the same specific voices to have occupied the same characters without interruption for 25 years. In live-action television, actors age, their faces change in ways the camera registers and the audience notices. Their life circumstances evolve in ways that affect their availability and their motivation. Their careers develop trajectories that create conflicts with the commitment that a long-running show requires. The physical reality of human beings means that every live-action ensemble has a natural lifespan, a period during which the same faces can plausibly occupy the same roles before the accumulation of visible years makes the original casting seem like historical footage rather than current drama. Animated shows are simply not subject to this limitation in any meaningful way. Peter Griffin looks exactly as he did in 1999. His voice has not aged in any perceptible way. The specific qualities of Seth MacFarlane's performance in the role, built around a particular vocal register modeled on a specific Rhode Island accent he once overheard, has been available to be delivered with the same precision and the same specific energy in every recording session across the show's entire run. Seth MacFarlane voices 4 of the show's most prominent characters: Peter Griffin, Brian Griffin, Stewie Griffin, and Glenn Quagmire. This is a remarkable concentration of narrative presence in a single performer's work. Peter is the center of the show's domestic universe, its anchor and its engine, and the character whose stupidity and occasional sweetness drives the majority of the show's stories. Brian is the show's voice of relative reason, the character who serves as the audience's grounded point of entry into a household of eccentrics, and whose relationship with Peter provides the show's most consistent emotional through line. Stewie is the show's most inventive comedic creation, the baby with the British accent and the world domination ambitions, and the elaborate schemes who became the show's breakout character during its early seasons. And Quagmire is the show's most outrageous supporting figure, the neighbor whose specific comedic persona has generated some of the show's most memorable recurring material. That MacFarlane voices all four of these characters means that when he is in the recording booth, he is present in the show's creative core in a way that goes far beyond the title of creator or executive producer. He is inhabiting the characters he created in the most direct possible way, channeling their specific energies and comic registers, and making real-time creative decisions about how each of them sounds and moves and responds that no writer's room note or directorial suggestion can fully substitute for. The continuity of his performance across 25 years is itself a form of creative preservation, a guarantee that Peter and Brian and Stewie and Quagmire will always sound like themselves because the same person who invented their voices is still delivering them. Alex Borstein has been Lois Griffin since the show's beginning, bringing a specific combination of warmth and exasperation and occasional ruthlessness to the character that has given Lois a distinctive personality within the ensemble. Borstein is herself a writer and comedian with a creative sensibility that extends well beyond voice acting, and her presence in the recording booth has always been more than just a technical performance. She brings a genuine understanding of the character's comedic and emotional possibilities to every session, and her relationship with the other cast members, built over decades of shared creative work, produces the specific quality of lived-in ensemble chemistry that you cannot manufacture and can only develop over time. Seth Green, who voiced Chris Griffin through the entirety of the show's run, built his own recognizable on-screen presence through appearances in the Austin Powers films and in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and dozens of other productions during the years Family Guy was airing. He could have allowed his live-action career to create conflicts with his voice commitment to the show. He chose not to, maintaining his presence in the Family Guy ensemble throughout his career's development, and providing a consistent vocal anchor for a character whose specific gentle confusion has been one of the show's reliable comic resources. Mila Kunis took over Meg Griffin from Lacey Chabert at the start of the second season and has maintained the role through every subsequent season, through her own parallel development into a significant film star with prominent roles in Black Swan, Ted, and numerous other productions, through years during which her career placed her in a category of Hollywood prominence that made a supporting voice role in an animated television show seem like a significant opportunity cost. She has continued because of a loyalty to the character and to the production that reflects the specific kind of professional commitment that characterizes the best long-running cast relationships. Patrick Warburton's voice as Joe Swanson is among the most distinctive in American animation, a specific instrument of deadpan authority and physical comedy that has given the character a memorable presence across every season of the show's run. His voice work as Joe is, in many ways, a pure expression of his comedic gifts, the ability to deliver absurd material with absolute seriousness in a way that makes the absurdity funnier for being treated as though it were completely ordinary. The contractual relationships that have held this ensemble together are not primarily matters of sentiment or loyalty in the abstract sense. They are commercial arrangements that have been structured to align the financial interests of the performers with the continued existence of the show. The 2013 contract renegotiation, which secured core cast salaries between $175,000 and $225,000 per episode, established a compensation level that gave each performer substantial financial incentive to maintain their commitment while remaining within the production budget's capacity to sustain. When a performer is earning that level of compensation for work that fits into a recording schedule that leaves ample time for other professional activities, the rational decision is to maintain the relationship rather than to create the disruption and uncertainty of departure. Cast stability creates a specific kind of institutional value that is genuinely difficult to quantify, but genuinely important to recognize. The accumulated experience of 25 years of performing the same characters, the specific understanding of where each character's voice goes in moments of surprise or anger or sadness or comedy, the intuitive sense of how the characters relate to each other and what makes their interactions funny, all of this lives in the people who have been doing it and nowhere else. It cannot be documented in a casting brief or transferred to new performers through coaching, because it is not a set of rules but a set of accumulated reflexes, a vast repository of creative knowledge about specific characters that only exists in the people who have inhabited those characters continuously for decades. If the show were canceled and the cast dispersed, that repository would be gone, and any subsequent revival would start from a substantially lower floor than the 2005 revival was able to start from, because of how much institutional knowledge the returning cast brought with them, even after 3 years away. There is also the question of what cast stability signals to the audience, which is something that operates partly outside the realm of conscious recognition, but that contributes meaningfully to the experience of watching the show. When you watch a Family Guy episode in 2026, you are hearing the same voices you heard when you first encountered the show, whether that first encounter was in 1999 or 2005 or 2015 or last month on Hulu. Those voices carry the accumulated weight of their entire history with these characters, and the audience's recognition of them is itself a form of comfort, a form of the familiarity that makes comfort viewing feel like coming home rather than like visiting somewhere new. The cast's continuity is not separate from the show's streaming success. It is one of the structural reasons the comfort viewing experience the show provides is as powerful as it is. The loyalty loop, as I have been describing it, is a self-reinforcing system. The cast stays because the compensation is good and the working relationship is established, and the institutional knowledge they carry makes them more valuable to the production than any replacement could be. The show stays in production because the cast's continuity is one of its primary commercial assets, ensuring the quality and consistency of the audience experience that drives the streaming numbers that justify the licensing fees that fund the production. The production's commercial success justifies the cast's compensation, which maintains the cast's commitment, which maintains the production's quality, which maintains the commercial success. The loop turns in on itself and produces stability, and stability in the entertainment industry is rarer and more valuable than almost anyone who observes the industry from outside fully appreciates. The institutional knowledge also extends beyond the cast to the broader production team. Writers who have been working on the show for a decade or more carry a detailed understanding of what the show is and how it works that cannot be quickly replicated by new arrivals. Directors who have been working with MacFarlane and the voice cast for years have developed a specific fluency with the show's comedic timing and emotional registers that newer directors must develop over time. The show's music team, which employs a live orchestra to record original scores for every episode at the Newman Soundstage on the former 20th Century Fox lot, has built relationships and workflows that produce a specific quality of musical comedy that has been consistent across the show's entire run. All of this accumulated professional knowledge is part of the show's commercial value, and all of it would be dispersed and difficult to reassemble if the production were to stop. Section 10. Cultural Permanence. How the show became a language. There is a threshold that certain pieces of popular culture cross at some point in their evolution from entertainment to artifact, after which they stop being something people consume and start being something people know. They accumulate enough shared reference points distributed across enough minds and enough varied contexts that they begin to function as a communication medium, a set of tools that people deploy in conversation to express things with a specific efficiency that only shared cultural knowledge enables. When two people who have both watched a show use a line or a reference from it to communicate something to each other, they are not just quoting. They are using a language that the show created, a shorthand whose meaning is richer and more specific than the literal content of the words. The Simpsons crossed this threshold decades ago. Its phrases and characters and specific moments are so thoroughly distributed across American English that people invoke them without always knowing the source, without always knowing which episode a reference came from or what it meant in its original context. The phrases have detached from their origins and become something more general, part of the ambient vocabulary of American cultural life that is transmitted from person to person through the ordinary processes of conversation and humor and shared experience. Family Guy has crossed this threshold too. The evidence is everywhere in American culture if you pay attention to how people actually talk to each other, particularly how people who grew up with the show talk to each other. The specific sound that Peter Griffin makes when mildly inconvenienced has become one of the most recognizable audio signatures in the culture, reproduced in contexts entirely divorced from the television show for people who recognize it immediately and feel the specific pleasure of shared recognition. The verbal formula that introduces a cutaway comparison, the phrase structure that signals to anyone who grew up with the show that an illustrative absurdity is coming, has entered casual conversation as a way of structuring a particular kind of joke. The voices and speech registers of the show's central characters have become available as comedic costumes, brief performances that people adopt and discard in conversation with the confidence that comes from knowing their audience shares the same cultural knowledge. These things cannot be measured or monetized directly. They exist in the informal economy of everyday conversation and shared humor, and they are transmitted from person to person through processes that no corporation controls and no licensing agreement captures. But they matter commercially in indirect ways that are real and significant. They ensure the show's continued presence in the cultural consciousness of people who have not watched a new episode in years, maintaining the kind of ambient brand awareness that keeps a property from sliding into the irrelevance that eventually claims most entertainment franchises. They create the specific quality of instant recognition that makes walking into a store and seeing Family Guy merchandise feel like encountering an old friend rather than an unfamiliar brand competing for attention. And they create the specific kind of intergenerational transmission that has been one of the most important mechanisms of the show's continued commercial relevance. The generational transmission process is worth examining in some detail because it is one of the less obvious but genuinely important factors in the show's long-term sustainability. The people who watched Family Guy in its original 1999 broadcast run are now in their 40s. Their children, who were born after the show premiered or were very young during its original run, encountered the show first through their parents' casual references to it, through the phrases and characters that their parents invoked in everyday conversation without particularly thinking about where those references came from. These children then discovered the show itself, through streaming or through the TikTok clip economy, and formed their own relationships with it. Relationships that were shaped but not entirely determined by the parental context in which they first became aware of it. The show's cultural vocabulary passed from one generation to the next through the ordinary processes of family life, and in doing so, it expanded its audience base in a way that required no marketing investment and no deliberate strategy. The TikTok phenomenon has been the most dramatic and most publicly visible recent instance of this kind of generational expansion, and it operates through a mechanism that is both specific to the contemporary media environment and deeply rooted in the show's particular structural characteristics. TikTok's recommendation algorithm, which surfaces content based on engagement metrics regardless of the content's age or origin, has been exceptionally favorable to Family Guy clips for reasons that are structural rather than arbitrary. The show's cutaway format produces self-contained comic moments that range from 15 to 60 seconds in length, which is precisely the duration that the short-form video environment of TikTok rewards. A cutaway gag extracted from an episode that aired in 2011 operates as a complete, satisfying piece of content when posted on TikTok in 2024, requiring no context, no prior knowledge of the surrounding story, no understanding of which season the episode was from. The setup is contained within the clip. The punchline arrives within seconds. The experience is complete and shareable and funny, and the algorithm rewards it accordingly. The scale of this clip economy has been genuinely extraordinary. The primary hashtag for the show on TikTok has accumulated views numbering in the tens of billions. Individual channels devoted to posting Family Guy clips have built followings of millions of subscribers by consistently delivering the specific kind of brief, context-free humor that the show's format makes uniquely available at scale. The show has approximately 400 episodes, each containing multiple cutaway gags of clip-appropriate length, which means the supply of shareable content is both enormous and continuously being replenished by new episodes. The clip economy around the show is not declining as it ages. It is expanding, as both the existing catalog and the new episodes contribute to the pool of available material. The academic attention that the show has accumulated over its run is another indicator of its cultural depth, signaling that it has become something that educated people consider worth taking seriously as a text, as well as a source of entertainment. University courses have incorporated Family Guy as material for examining the economics of the television industry, the ethics of offensive comedy, the political dimensions of animated sitcoms, and the specific ways that popular culture both reflects and shapes American values. There are peer-reviewed academic papers analyzing specific episodes and specific creative choices in terms that treat the show as a document of cultural and historical significance. There are books, some of them serious scholarly works and some of them fan-oriented popular texts, that take the show as their primary subject. This kind of intellectual engagement does not make a show commercially valuable in any direct sense, but it is a reliable marker of the kind of cultural permanence that underlies long-term commercial durability. The international dimension of the show's cultural penetration is an aspect of its story that gets inadequate attention in discussions primarily focused on the American market. Family Guy is distributed in more than 100 countries, dubbed into dozens of languages, and has developed fan communities in markets as diverse as Brazil, Germany, Australia, Japan, Mexico, and across Southeast Asia. The show's specific comedy, its physical humor, and its character dynamics, and its particular register of domestic absurdity, has demonstrated a capacity to travel across cultural contexts that is not universal among American animated comedies, and that has given the franchise a genuinely global footprint. In markets where streaming services have been expanding rapidly, including Latin America and Southeast Asia, Family Guy is being encountered by new audiences not as a legacy property from a previous era but as a fresh discovery, something they are finding for the first time through the streaming interface and engaging with on its own terms. These new international viewers contribute to the streaming numbers that Disney and Hulu report to investors, to the global merchandise sales that the licensing program generates, and to the international advertising revenue that flows from the show's presence on streaming platforms with global reach. The cultural permanence that the show has achieved in the United States is being established progressively in new markets as global streaming infrastructure brings it to audiences who were not previously able to access it, creating a slow but continuous expansion of the show's total commercial footprint. All of this, the generational transmission and the TikTok clip economy and the academic attention and the international expansion, describes a show that has become embedded in the culture in ways that extend well beyond the weekly schedule of a broadcast television program. The show exists not just as episodes but as a cultural presence, a set of references and characters and sounds and phrases that occupy the shared memory of the people who know them and that are transmitted continuously to new audiences through the informal processes of cultural life. That kind of cultural permanence is genuinely difficult to achieve and genuinely difficult to displace, and it is one of the primary reasons that the commercial case for the show's continued production is so strong and so likely to remain strong for the foreseeable future. Section 11. The Fox and Disney Dynamic Corporate Immortality. To fully understand the most recent and most structurally secure phase of Family Guy's commercial existence, you need to understand the specific corporate architecture that surrounds the show in 2026, because that architecture has created a set of mutual dependencies so thorough and so deeply reinforcing that the show's survival has become, in practical terms, structurally guaranteed for as long as those dependencies hold. The architecture was established by one of the most significant corporate transactions in the history of American media. Disney's acquisition of most of 21st Century Fox's entertainment and media assets, completed in March of 2019 for approximately $71 billion. The scale of this acquisition is genuinely difficult to hold in mind all at once. Disney purchased the 20th Century Fox film studio with its century-long library of theatrical releases. It purchased the FX and FXX cable networks. It purchased the National Geographic properties. It purchased a majority stake in Hulu, which at the time was a three-way joint venture, but which Disney subsequently moved to fully control. It purchased the international media properties including Star International and a controlling stake in Sky in the United Kingdom. And it purchased the Fox television production companies, including the entities responsible for producing Family Guy, The Simpsons, Bob's Burgers, and American Dad, which collectively became 20th Television Animation within the Disney corporate family. Crucially, the acquisition did not include the Fox Broadcasting Company, the network that airs these shows in prime time. The Fox Broadcast Network remained under the separate ownership of the Fox Corporation controlled by Rupert Murdoch and his family, creating the specific and commercially interesting situation that has defined Family Guy's corporate position ever since. The show is produced by a Disney subsidiary, aired by a network owned by a company that is not Disney, and streamed on a platform that is owned by Disney. The revenue flows accordingly, with advertising income going to Fox, licensing fees from Fox going to Disney's production entity, streaming licensing fees going from Hulu to Disney's production entity, and international distribution revenue flowing through Disney's global content operation. For Fox, the arrangement is straightforwardly beneficial in ways that make its continuation the obvious choice. The licensing fee it pays to air Family Guy is substantially lower than the development and production cost of creating a replacement show that might or might not attract the audience that Family Guy reliably brings to the animation. Domination block. Fox does not have to bear the creative risk of launching new shows to fill the time slots that Family Guy occupies. It pays a licensing fee to a known quantity and receives a reliable audience in return, an audience that has demonstrated its stability and its loyalty over 2 decades of continuous broadcast presence. From Fox's perspective, continuing the arrangement is the conservative and commercially rational choice, and there is nothing in the current commercial environment that makes the alternative seem more attractive. For Disney, the arrangement is even more straightforwardly beneficial because the company receives value from the show's continued existence across multiple platforms that it owns, while paying only the production cost of making the show, which, as described earlier, is modest relative to the total revenue the show generates. The advertising revenue from Fox's broadcast of the show flows to Fox, but the licensing fee Fox pays for those broadcast rights flows back to Disney. The streaming advertising and subscription revenue from Hulu flows to Disney, the international distribution revenue flows to Disney, the merchandise and licensing income from the global licensing program flows to Disney. The show costs approximately $30 to $40 million per season to produce and generates multiples of that amount in total revenue across all its commercial dimensions, with the majority of that revenue flowing to its corporate owner. The mutual dependence between Fox and Disney around Family Guy and the other animated shows in the same arrangement is so thorough that neither party has a rational incentive to disrupt it unilaterally. Fox cannot easily produce comparable programming without Disney's production resources. Disney cannot easily maintain the streaming and international revenue from these properties without the broadcast presence that Fox provides to keep them in the cultural conversation. The arrangement is genuinely symbiotic, producing benefits for each party that depend on the other party's continued participation, and the April 2025 mega deal that extended it through the 2028 to 2029 television season was its explicit public confirmation. The deal announced on the 2nd of April 2025 was described in the joint press release as an unprecedented 4-year renewal, covering Family Guy, The Simpsons, Bob's Burgers, and American Dad simultaneously, guaranteeing each show through the 2028 to 2029 season. The language of the announcement was worth paying attention to closely. Fox Entertainment CEO Rob Wade stated that the renewals reaffirmed the company's commitment to the successful partnership built with Disney, and that the collaboration had generated and would continue to generate meaningful, long-term value, strategically building audiences from Fox to Hulu to fans worldwide. This framing, which emphasizes the multi-platform audience-building function of the arrangement rather than any artistic or creative justification, is a completely transparent description of why the deal was made. Both parties benefit financially from the arrangement, and the extension of the arrangement for 4 more years reflects their mutual assessment that those financial benefits will continue at levels sufficient to justify the commitment. For Family Guy specifically, seasons 24 through 27 are guaranteed under this deal, each consisting of 15 episodes. This will bring the total episode count to approximately 450 to 480 episodes by the end of the deal period, making Family Guy one of the 5 longest-running scripted primetime programs in American television history, a distinction that further reinforces its institutional significance and its commercial value as a benchmark and an anchor for everything built around it. Seth MacFarlane's public discussion of the show's future in the context of this deal has been characteristically honest about the balance between creative passion and commercial logic that defines his ongoing relationship with it. In various interviews over the past several years, he has acknowledged that there was a period when he felt the show had run its creative course and that continuing it was primarily an exercise in commercial maintenance. He has also said that reviewing the streaming performance data changed his perspective, that seeing the scale of the audience actively choosing to engage with the show in the streaming environment was genuinely surprising and genuinely affecting, that it represented evidence of a relationship between the show and its audience that the declining broadcast ratings had obscured rather than ended. He has described the show as having achieved what he calls escape velocity, a state in which the ongoing commercial and cultural value it generates is large enough and stable enough that ending it would require evidence of decline that is simply not present in the available data. The MacFarlane who signed the NBC Universal deal in January of 2020, the $200 million 5-year agreement that moved his production company away from the Fox corporate family, is worth understanding in the context of his ongoing relationship with Family Guy. The NBC Universal deal did not take him away from Family Guy, which continued to be produced by 20th Television Animation under the Disney umbrella. What it did was establish his independent creative identity, separate from the show that had defined his career, and create the conditions under which he could continue to be associated with Family Guy as a voice artist and executive producer without being exclusively defined by it. His relationship with the show since that deal has been one of a person who maintains a significant professional commitment to something he created while simultaneously building other things and pursuing other ambitions. The creative ambivalence that he has been candid about does not translate into professional withdrawal, because the professional commitment is governed by commercial logic that makes departure irrational. The Writers Guild strike of 2023 added a further layer of complexity to the Fox-Disney-MacFarlane dynamic. MacFarlane joined the picket line publicly and visibly, consistent with the position he had taken during the 2007 to 2008 strike, and consistent with the labor politics he had expressed publicly for years. The Family Guy showrunners Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin similarly declined to work during the strike, which lasted until late 2023 and created production delays that affected the delivery schedule for subsequent seasons. When the strike ended, the production resumed, and the April 2025 megadeal that followed indicated that the disruption had not changed the fundamental commercial calculation that keeps the show in continuous production. The strike was a disruption to the schedule, but not a disruption to the economic logic, and the economic logic prevailed as it consistently has across every challenge the show has faced in its 25-year history. The Disney acquisition also brought a dimension to the show's corporate existence that was entirely absent during its Fox-only years. The specific kind of institutional attention that the world's largest entertainment company brings to the management of its intellectual property portfolio. Disney is not a company that allows commercially valuable assets to decay through inattention or poor management. Its entire corporate philosophy is organized around the creation, maintenance, and maximization of intellectual property value over long time horizons, and the acquisition of 21st Century Fox's assets brought several new properties into that management philosophy. Family Guy, as one of the most commercially valuable animated properties in the newly acquired portfolio, benefits from the specific Disney approach to IP stewardship, which includes aggressive licensing programs, careful attention to brand consistency, and the willingness to make substantial long-term investments in properties that have demonstrated their commercial durability. Section 12. Why it will never end the 30th anniversary and the road ahead. There is a thought experiment that is useful to conduct at this point in the story, as a way of clarifying what the commercial logic described in the preceding sections actually means for the show's future and for the durability of the protections that have accumulated around it. Imagine that the people currently making the renewal decisions about Family Guy were operating purely and exclusively on the basis of critical and creative quality, that the boardroom conversation was entirely about whether the episodes being produced in the mid-2020s represent the same quality of creative work as the episodes produced in the early 2000s, and that the renewal decision depended on the answer to that question alone. Under those conditions, the conversation would be different. The honest critical consensus on Family Guy's later seasons is mixed in ways that distinguish it clearly from the consensus on the early ones. The original 3 seasons are widely considered to be the peak of the show's creative achievement, seasons in which the characters were fully realized and consistently written, in which the humor was genuinely inventive and the storytelling was grounded in genuine understanding of the specific comedic universe MacFarlane had created. The post-revival seasons through approximately season 7 maintained a sufficient portion of those original qualities to produce genuinely strong individual episodes alongside the ones that showed the early signs of creative drift. From approximately season 8 onward, the critical picture has been more consistently mixed, with the character dynamics that long-term fans valued most having evolved in directions that many found less satisfying, and the creative habits that critics had identified as weaknesses having become more pronounced. None of this is a secret. MacFarlane himself has been candid about the unevenness of the later seasons. The show's own writers have occasionally acknowledged it in the meta-humor that the show directs at itself. Long-term fans discuss it in online spaces with a combination of nostalgia and resignation, that is, the specific emotional register of people who love something that has changed in ways they did not choose but have chosen to accept. But this thought experiment is, in the actual commercial reality that governs the show's future, essentially irrelevant. The people who renew Family Guy are not primarily critics. They are corporate executives whose professional and fiduciary obligations run to the shareholders and investors whose capital funds the enterprise. For those people, the relevant question is not whether the show is as good as it was in 2002. It is whether the show generates commercial returns that justify the cost of producing it. And the answer to that question, assessed honestly and completely across all the revenue streams and commercial relationships described in this script, is not ambiguous. The show continues to generate returns that justify its production by comfortable margins year after year. Family Guy in 2026 is one of the most commercially valuable animated properties in the history of American entertainment. It is the third most streamed program in the United States across all platforms in the most recent complete year for which data is available. It generates substantial licensing and merchandise revenue from a global commercial ecosystem that has been operating continuously for 2 decades. It anchors a broadcast programming block that Fox has committed to through the 2028 to 2029 television season, under a deal that was described as unprecedented at the time of its announcement. It produces all of this commercial value at a production cost that is modest by the standards of any comparable entertainment property. The commercial case for its continued existence is not uncertain or debatable. It is clear, and it is strong, and it is reinforced from multiple directions simultaneously. The road ahead runs through the guaranteed seasons 24, 25, 26, and 27, through the production pipeline funded and validated by the April 2025 mega deal, through the 30th anniversary of a premiere that aired on a Sunday night in January 1999, after one of the largest live television audiences in American history had assembled to watch a football game and stayed to watch. Something entirely new. The deals are in place. The production infrastructure is established. The voice cast remains committed, the same voices that have defined these characters across the entire arc of the show's existence, still sitting in recording booths and doing the work that has made them among the most recognizable performers in the history of American animation. Whether the show continues beyond season 27 depends on commercial conditions that cannot be fully predicted from the present vantage point, but that show no signs of deteriorating at the rate that would make cancellation after the current deal period more attractive than renewal. The streaming numbers would need to decline dramatically and consistently. The licensing and merchandise ecosystem would need to contract substantially. The corporate arrangements between Fox and Disney would need to change in ways that disrupted the mutual financial benefits that currently make continuation the rational choice for both parties. None of these things are impossible. All of them would need to happen simultaneously or nearly so to change the fundamental calculation that has kept the show in production for the past 2 decades. It is also worth noting that the show has a specific commercial advantage that becomes more rather than less powerful with each passing year. The sheer size of its back catalog and the breadth of audience that catalog has reached over 25 years of continuous operation. Every year the show continues to produce new episodes. It adds to a library that is already one of the largest in the history of animated television, and that generates streaming revenue that is, in important respects, independent of how any individual new episode is received. The new episodes keep the show current, keep it in the cultural conversation, keep the characters alive and present in the minds of viewers who engage with them through social media and merchandise and casual conversation, as well as through actual viewing. But the library is the foundation. the accumulated creative output of 25 years that earns its own revenue continuously and that will continue to earn that revenue whether or not a new season is in production. The specific cultural moment we are currently in which streaming has democratized access to back catalogs, and in which older programming is experiencing a renaissance of discovery by younger viewers who were not alive or were very young during the original broadcast runs, is particularly favorable to a property like Family Guy. Young viewers who encounter the show through TikTok clips and then pursue it on Hulu find a library of 400-plus episodes that can sustain months of engagement. Those months of engagement contribute to the streaming numbers that justify the licensing fees that fund the production. The cycle perpetuates itself across generational lines as well as within them, and the generational perpetuation is one of the most commercially durable phenomena in entertainment. Underneath all of the commercial mathematics and the corporate structures and the streaming data and the licensing agreements, there is a simpler and in some ways more essential truth about why Family Guy has never been canceled again and why it will continue to exist for the foreseeable future. This show found an audience that genuinely loved it. Not just liked it, not just watched it when nothing else was on, but specifically and passionately loved it in a way that expressed itself in 3 million DVD purchases during the years when new episodes were not being made, in the millions of viewers who found it on Adult Swim and turned it into the highest-rated show on that block, in the tens of billions of minutes of streaming viewership that represent the continued engagement of millions of people making active choices about how to spend their time. That love, accumulated over 25 years and transmitted across generational lines and continuously refreshed by the clip economy and the streaming availability and the cultural vocabulary that the show has deposited in the people who know, it is the foundation on which all of the commercial machinery described in this script was built. The commercial machinery is real, and it is important, and it is the proximate reason the show continues. But the machinery was built on that foundation, and without that foundation, none of it would have been assembled in the first place. A show that nobody loved would not have generated 3 million DVD sales during its cancellation years. It would not have become the highest-rated program on Adult Swim. It would not have drawn 11 million viewers to its comeback premiere. It would not have accumulated 42 billion minutes of streaming viewership in a single year. The commercial case for Family Guy's continued existence is ultimately grounded in the fact that people love it, and the scale of that love, measured across 25 years and across every available metric, is one of the most remarkable things in the history of American entertainment. The show that was born from an 11-minute thesis film made by a 20-year-old in a Rhode Island art school that was canceled twice before most of its current audience was born, that was rescued by the specific loyalty of fans who bought physical copies of something they could have watched for free, that found a second commercial life in the streaming era more substantial than anything its broadcast years produced, that has become a cultural language spoken fluently by multiple generations of viewers on multiple continents, that has been locked into commercial protection by the corporate architecture of 2 of the largest entertainment companies in the world, that has never been canceled again because the mathematics of continuing it have always been more favorable than the mathematics of ending it, is still here. In the soft glow of a phone screen held over a face beginning to relax toward sleep, in the comfortable background noise of a streaming session that has been running for 3 hours without anyone deciding to stop, in the TikTok feed of a teenager who has never watched a full episode and who will probably find one tomorrow, in the recording booth, where the same voices that have occupied these characters for a quarter century are still doing the work, in the boardroom where the renewal decisions are made based on numbers that make the right answer obvious. In all of these places, simultaneously and continuously, the Griffins are there, still talking, still breathing, still somehow, inexplicably, wonderfully alive. The story of why Family Guy has never been canceled again is not one story but many, layered on top of each other and reinforcing each other in ways that make the total protection more robust than any single component would be alone. It is the story of the economics of animation and the specific cost advantages that make low-rated animated shows commercially viable in ways that live-action shows with comparable numbers never could be. It is the story of the streaming revolution and how it redistributed television audiences in ways that turned Family Guy's specific structural characteristics into extraordinary commercial assets. It is the story of a corporate acquisition that created a set of mutual dependencies, aligning the interests of two of the world's largest entertainment companies around the show's continued existence. It is the story of a voice cast whose stability across 25 years has made the show's characters more durable than virtually any other ensemble in contemporary animation. It is the story of cultural permanence achieved through generational transmission and the viral mechanics of short-form social media and the specific pleasures of comfort viewing in a streaming environment that makes revisiting familiar things as easy as opening an app. And underneath all of it, it is the story of an audience that loved something and found ways to express that love that the people who canceled the show could not see, but that ultimately changed everything. Now you know the hidden reason. Every piece of it, the full picture, from the thesis film to the mega deal, from the Adult Swim reruns to the 42 billion streaming minutes, from the first cancellation to the guarantee of seasons running to the 30th anniversary and beyond. The show that should have died has not died, and the reasons why it has not are more interesting, more complex, and more revealing about how the entertainment industry actually works than the simple story of popularity or quality or luck would suggest. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, through every section and every piece of this long story, I am genuinely grateful for the time you spent here. This channel exists for exactly the kind of viewer who wants to go deep, who wants to understand not just what happened, but why and how, who is willing to spend an evening or a long drive or a slow drift towards sleep inside a story told with care and with the respect for the subject matter that it deserves. If that is you and you have not yet subscribed, please consider doing that now. It takes a moment and it makes an enormous difference to what we can continue building here. If this resonated with you, share it with someone who loves this kind of storytelling. That is how a community like this one grows. Thank you for being here. I will see you in the next one. End of script. Extended section, the writer's room, the creative process, and why the formula survived. To truly understand why Family Guy has endured when so many comparable shows have not, you need to understand something about the specific mechanics of how the show is made. Because the production process itself contains structural features that contribute to the show's longevity in ways that are rarely discussed in the commercial analyses and the ratings breakdowns and the streaming data reports. The way Family Guy is written and produced has always been different from the way most American primetime comedies are made, and those differences have consequences for the show's ability to sustain output across decades without the catastrophic quality drops that have ended other long-running comedies. The writer's room for Family Guy, from its earliest seasons through its current production, has operated on a model that emphasizes volume and variety over the kind of tightly integrated serial storytelling that requires every writer to be working in perfect alignment with every other writer at every moment. The cutaway gag format, which has been both the show's most celebrated feature and its most criticized crutch depending on whom you ask, has an underappreciated production advantage. It makes individual jokes modular and substitutable in ways that more narratively integrated comedy does not. A cutaway that does not land can be removed and replaced without affecting the structure of the surrounding episode. A new cutaway can be added to fill time or punch up a section that feels slow without requiring the surrounding story to be restructured. The modularity of the format gives the production team a degree of flexibility in assembling and revising episodes that has helped maintain a baseline of watchability across seasons when the longer narrative material has been less consistently strong. The show has also benefited from the specific way that its humor ages. Comedy that is rooted in character, in the specific personalities and relationship dynamics of a fixed cast of people, ages differently and more gracefully than comedy rooted in current events or contemporary cultural references. The jokes that depend on the audience recognizing a specific public figure or a specific news story from 2008 or 2015 are the ones that feel most dated when you watch older episodes today. The jokes that depend on Peter Griffin being a certain kind of person and Brian Griffin being another kind of person, and the tension between those two ways of being in the world are, in important respects, as fresh as they were when the show premiered, because the personalities they depend on are timeless archetypes expressed in specific and memorable forms rather than commentary on circumstances that have long since passed. This character-based aging pattern has been commercially important because it means the show's back catalog, The 400-plus episodes that generate the streaming viewership numbers that justify the licensing fees that fund the production retains its value better than the back catalog of a more topical comedy would. When you watch a Family Guy episode from 2005 on Hulu today, most of it is still funny in the way it was funny in 2005 because the funniness comes from the characters and the show's specific worldview rather than from references to things that have ceased to be culturally relevant. The back catalog earns its streaming revenue by being genuinely entertaining rather than by trading on nostalgia for things that once seemed contemporary but now feel dated. And that quality of sustained entertainment value is a commercial asset that accumulates rather than depreciates. The show's musical component is another production feature that contributes to its longevity in ways that are often overlooked. Family Guy has employed a live orchestra throughout its run, recording original scores for every episode at the Newman Soundstage on what was once the 20th Century Fox studio lot in Los Angeles. This commitment to live orchestral music, unusual for an animated television comedy, and expensive relative to the synthesized or library music alternatives that most comparable shows use, produces a specific quality of comedic timing in the scored scenes that is difficult to achieve through other means. Music serves comedy in ways that are subtle but real, establishing rhythms and expectational patterns that set up punchlines and transitions in ways the audience feels without consciously recognizing. The live orchestra gives Family Guy a musical richness that has been a consistent element of the show's identity, and that contributes to the specific feeling of watching it, the sense that the production takes its own comedy seriously enough to score it with the care it would bring to a more formally prestigious project. The voice recording process has its own contribution to the show's consistent quality across decades. The practice of having the cast record their lines in the same booth at the same time, rather than in separate sessions that are later edited together, produces the specific quality of ensemble chemistry that makes the characters' interactions feel genuinely responsive to each other rather than like separate performances assembled in post-production. The jokes that emerge from genuine, in-the-moment responses between performers, the specific timing adjustments and emotional colorings that come from two actors actually hearing each other rather than performing to a script in isolation, are qualities of the finished product that the audience perceives without necessarily being able to name. They are part of why watching Family Guy feels different from watching animated shows produced with less ensemble-focused recording practices. All of these production details, the writer's room structure and the modular format, and the live orchestra and the ensemble recording practice, describe a show that was built with a specific set of quality maintenance tools embedded in its production process from the beginning. None of these tools guarantee that every episode will be brilliant, but they provide a floor of watchability and of production quality that has helped the show maintain the baseline of commercial viability through the seasons when the creative ambition was lower and the consistency of individual episode quality was more variable. The floor is part of why the show has never fallen so far that the commercial case for its continued existence became genuinely doubtful. Extended section. The competition that never killed it. Simpsons, South Park, and the rivals that sharpened the brand. No discussion of Family Guy's survival is complete without acknowledging the specific competitive environment in which it has operated, because that environment has been among the most challenging in the history of animated television comedy and has featured adversaries whose quality and cultural prestige would have overwhelmed most properties that found themselves in direct comparison with them. Family Guy did not survive in a vacuum. It survived against The Simpsons and South Park and King of the Hill and Bob's Burgers and Archer and Rick and Morty and every other animated comedy of the past 25 years that competed for the same audience, the same cultural attention, and the same commercial opportunities. Understanding how it has maintained its position in this environment requires understanding what it offers that its competitors do not, and why those specific offerings have proven commercially durable even as the critical consensus has consistently favored some of the competition. The relationship between Family Guy and The Simpsons is the most historically significant and most commercially relevant of these competitive dynamics, because The Simpsons is the standard against which all American animated comedies are measured, and because the two shows have occupied adjacent positions in the same programming block for most of their shared broadcast history. The Simpsons created the commercial and cultural space in which Family Guy exists, demonstrating that adult animated comedy could sustain a broadcast audience at scale across decades and earning the kind of institutional respect and critical legitimacy that gave the format credibility. Family Guy arrived as a successor to and a departure from The Simpsons simultaneously, sharing the same broad formal category but doing distinctly different things within it. The Simpsons is, in the consensus of most people who take animated comedy seriously, a greater artistic achievement than Family Guy, particularly in its peak seasons. Its character work is richer, its social satire is more sophisticated, its emotional range is wider, and its best episodes operate at a level of comic and dramatic craft that Family Guy has rarely matched. The Simpsons has also achieved a form of cultural permanence that exceeds even what Family Guy has managed, its phrases and characters embedded in American English at a depth and a breadth that reflects 35-plus years of continuous cultural influence rather than 25. And yet Family Guy, for a substantial portion of its audience, offers something that The Simpsons does not offer with the same consistency: a specific quality of anarchic, frequently offensive, systematically irreverent humor that operates without the emotional warmth that has been central to The Simpsons' identity since its earliest seasons. The Simpsons cares about The Simpsons. The show's comedy is grounded in genuine love for its characters and genuine investment in their relationships. Family Guy's comedy in its peak years operated with a different emotional logic, one in which the characters' suffering and the transgression of social and comedic norms was itself the source of humor, rather than the backdrop against which emotionally meaningful stories played out. This is a genuine aesthetic difference rather than a quality difference, and it serves a real audience that wants exactly what Family Guy provides, and does not find it in equal measure anywhere else. South Park's relationship with Family Guy is one of the most publicly documented rivalries in the history of American television comedy, a relationship that went from mutual industry awareness to explicit and pointed creative conflict, when Trey Parker and Matt Stone devoted a two-part episode called Cartoon Wars to a sustained satirical attack on Family Guy's writing methodology and creative philosophy in 2006. The South Park episodes depicted Family Guy's jokes as being produced by sea creatures randomly combining idea balls, an unflattering characterization of the cutaway gag format that suggested the comedy required no genuine creative intelligence to produce. Parker and Stone also reportedly received phone calls from the writers of other animated comedies, thanking them for making the episodes, which suggested that the critique resonated within the industry beyond their own personal feelings about a competitor. The critique stung in part because it was not entirely wrong. The cutaway gag format, at its laziest, does produce the exactly kind of randomly assembled, disconnected joke that the South Park critique described. The Conway Twitty segments that appeared in multiple Family Guy episodes, in which the show would simply broadcast an extended performance by the country singer as its entire comedic offering for several minutes, were precisely the kind of content that made the South Park critique seem prescient rather than merely competitive. These were not examples of the cutaway format being used cleverly. They were examples of the production filling time with found content, because creating actual comedy was apparently not always the priority. But Family Guy survived the South Park critique and the industry consensus it crystallized, not by rehabilitating its reputation in the critical community, but by continuing to be watched by its audience in volumes that made the critical community's opinion commercially irrelevant. The South Park model, which prioritizes satirical intelligence and topical relevance and tight narrative structure over the loose, compilation-like approach of Family Guy, serves a different audience need than the one Family Guy serves. South Park's audience wants to be challenged and provoked and made to think. Family Guy's audience, in its overwhelming mass-market form, wants to be entertained with the specific pleasure of familiar characters, doing familiar things in ways that are intermittently funny without requiring any particular engagement or investment. These are different products serving different needs, and the commercial landscape of American entertainment is large enough to sustain both of them at scale. The arrival of Bob's Burgers in 2011 on the Fox animation domination block created a different kind of competitive dynamic, one based on quality and critical acclaim rather than on satirical attack. Bob's Burgers quickly established itself as one of the warmest, most emotionally genuine, and most consistently excellent animated comedies on American television, developing a devoted critical and fan following by doing exactly the things that Family Guy was most criticized for not doing: maintaining consistent, sympathetic characterization, building genuine emotional stakes in its stories, and writing jokes that emerged from character rather than from random cultural reference. Bob's Burgers sits in the Family Guy programming block every week, a direct and unflattering comparison, and has consistently received more enthusiastic critical notices than its neighbor. And yet, Family Guy has continued to draw substantially larger streaming audiences than Bob's Burgers, despite the critical consensus clearly favoring the latter. In 2024, Family Guy generated 42.44 billion streaming minutes, compared to Bob's Burgers at 36.8 billion, a gap that reflects the specific dynamics of the comfort viewing phenomenon and the cultural penetration advantage that older shows with larger catalogs enjoy in the streaming environment. The competition with Bob's Burgers does not hurt Family Guy commercially, and the coexistence of both shows in the same programming block has served Fox's animation brand by giving viewers who want different things reasons to watch different parts of the same night. The rise of Rick and Morty in the mid-2010s created yet another competitive dynamic, one that specifically tested Family Guy's claim to the adult animated comedy audience that values intelligence and originality above broad entertainment. Rick and Morty arrived with a specific kind of creative ambition that Family Guy had not consistently demonstrated in years, combining science fiction imagination with genuine emotional depth and a commitment to narrative consequences that animated comedy rarely attempts. Its first few seasons attracted exactly the kind of passionate, critical, and fan attention that Family Guy had attracted in its own early years, and the comparison between the two shows became a recurring theme in discussions of animated comedy quality. Family Guy has survived this competition, not by competing on Rick and Morty's terms, but by continuing to be what it is for the audience that wants what it is. The two shows are not competing for exactly the same viewers. The viewers who want Rick and Morty's specific brand of intelligent, emotionally ambitious animated comedy were never primarily Family Guy's audience, and their preference for Rick and Morty over Family Guy does not diminish the commercial value of Family Guy for the audience that prefers it. The adult animated comedy audience is segmented, not unified, and different segments have different requirements that different shows fulfill with different degrees of success. Family Guy's commercial durability in this competitive environment reflects a fundamental truth about entertainment markets. Size and consistency are commercially powerful even in the absence of critical respect. The show is not the most acclaimed animated comedy on American television. It has not been for many years, if it ever was without qualification. But it is, by the streaming viewership numbers, one of the most watched animated programs in the world, and being the most watched is commercially more important than being the most acclaimed in an industry where revenue is ultimately what determines whether a show continues to be made. Extended section: The Writers' Strike Legacy, How Labor Shaped Survival. The two Writers Guild strikes that affected Family Guy during its run, the 2007 to 2008 walkout and the 2023 work stoppage, deserve examination as distinct events rather than simply as parallel disruptions, because they affected the show differently and revealed different things about its institutional position in the entertainment industry at each moment in its history. The 2007 to 2008 Writers Guild strike began in November of 2007, approximately 3 months into Family Guy's 6th season production, and lasted for 100 days before a deal was reached in February of 2008. The strike was fundamentally about residuals from new media, specifically about whether writers should receive compensation for content viewed on the then-nascent internet platforms that were beginning to distribute television episodes and that writers understood would eventually transform the economics of the industry. The writers were correct in their assessment of what the internet would become for entertainment distribution, and the deal they eventually reached included provisions for internet streaming residuals that proved enormously more valuable than anyone could have known at the time. McFarlane joined the picket lines and made his support for the striking writers visible and public in a way that reflected both his genuine political commitment to labor rights and his specific understanding that the writers in the room were the people whose work made his shows what they were. His position created friction with Fox, when the network made the decision to air 3 already completed Family Guy episodes during the strike period without the show's creators' blessing. The network had the contractual right to broadcast episodes that had been delivered before the strike began, but exercising that right against MacFarlane's wishes was a demonstration of the specific kind of institutional indifference to creator relationships that had characterized Fox's handling of the show during its original run, and that contributed to MacFarlane's stated desire, expressed years later, to have the show on any other network. The creative disruption caused by the 3-month production stoppage was real. Television writing operates on tightly integrated schedules, with stories being developed and broken and refined across weeks of concentrated work by teams whose collaborative chemistry is specific and fragile. When that collaborative process is interrupted for an extended period, the resumption is not simply a matter of picking up where things left off. The rhythm is broken. The creative momentum that had been building must be rebuilt from a lower base. Story ideas that had been developing are displaced by new ideas that must be developed under different conditions and with different collaborative energy. The episodes produced in the immediate aftermath of the 2007 to 2008 strike reflect some of these disruption effects in their uneven quality, though the show's format's modularity helped cushion the impact by allowing the stronger standalone elements to anchor the weaker episodes. The 2023 strike had a different character because it occurred in a fundamentally different industry context. By 2023, the streaming platforms that the 2007 strike had anticipated were not nascent experiments, but dominant commercial forces that had transformed the economics of every segment of the entertainment industry. The writers were striking in part for residuals from those streaming platforms, which had been paying writers' residuals under a formula that badly undervalued the role of streaming in the commercial performance of the shows they had written. The issues were different from 2007 inches their specifics, but continuous with 2007 inches their fundamental concern, that the people who created the content that generated enormous commercial value for the studios and platforms were not receiving compensation proportionate to the commercial value they were creating. MacFarlane again joined the picket line. The Family Guy production again paused. The creative disruption was again real, producing delays in the delivery schedule that pushed subsequent season premieres further into the future and affected the show's broadcast schedule in ways that Fox and the production had to manage carefully. The resolution of the 2023 strike included meaningful improvements in streaming residuals that will benefit the Family Guy writing staff and the staffs of every other show whose episodes are among the most streamed on any platform, which means the settlement has particular commercial significance for writers who contributed to a catalog that is now being watched for tens of billions of minutes per year. What the two strikes together reveal about Family Guy's institutional position is something important about the show's relationship with the labor that creates it. The show's creator has been consistently and visibly on the side of the writers in both of these conflicts, not performatively, but through the specific act of walking off the production and joining the people demanding better compensation for their work. This consistency has earned MacFarlane a specific kind of credibility with the Writers Guild that is relatively unusual for someone at his level of success and institutional power, and it has contributed to a production environment that, whatever its other characteristics, is one in which the people doing the writing understand that the person at the top of the creative hierarchy shares their fundamental view of the industry's labor dynamics. The strikes also revealed something about the commercial resilience of the show itself. Both times, the production was interrupted for months, the delivery schedule was disrupted, and the network had to manage the resulting holes in its programming with filler and reruns. Both times, the show resumed production after the strike ended and continued as if the interruption had not fundamentally changed the calculus of its commercial viability. No strike-related disruption was severe enough to create the conditions under which cancellation became the rational response. The commercial logic that protected the show before each strike protected it through each strike and after each strike because that logic was grounded in the show's structural commercial characteristics rather than in the fragile week-to-week performance metrics that might have been more vulnerable to disruption. Extended section. What the numbers actually mean. A final accounting. Before the conclusion of this story, it is worth doing something that is rarely done in discussions of Family Guy's commercial performance. laying out the full numerical picture in one place with the context needed to understand what the numbers actually mean and why they tell the story they tell. Because numbers without context are easily misread, and the numbers surrounding Family Guy have been misread in both directions, with the declining broadcast ratings being used to argue that the show is dying, and the extraordinary streaming performance being used to argue that everything is fine when the reality is more nuanced than either of those readings. Captures. The broadcast ratings tell a story of genuine and sustained decline. The show's first season averaged 12.8 million households. The revival premiere in 2005 drew 11.85 million viewers. Season 4 averaged around 7.9 million viewers. The decline from that post-revival peak has been continuous, with the show falling through the 6s and the 5s and the 4s, and eventually into territory below 2 million by its later seasons. Season 20 averaged approximately 1.31 million viewers with a 0.45 rating in the adults 18 to 49 demographic. Season 23 averaged approximately 723,000 viewers with a 0.19 rating in that same demographic. These are not healthy broadcast numbers for any major network show. They are the numbers of a show that has lost the vast majority of the audience it once held in the broadcast environment. The streaming numbers tell a completely different and, in important respects, more commercially significant story. In 2024, Family Guy generated 42.44 billion minutes of viewing on Hulu. In a single week in late August 2024, it generated over 1 billion minutes of viewing, placing it among the 3 most-watched programs on any streaming service for that week. In 2025, it appeared on Nielsen's weekly streaming top 10 for 37 consecutive weeks. Nielsen's Arte Awards, presented in January 2026 for the 2025 calendar year, recognized Family Guy as the 2nd most-watched adult animation title and the 7th most-watched program overall across all streaming platforms. Seth MacFarlane's complete catalog generated over 60 billion viewing minutes in 2025 alone. How do you reconcile these two stories? The answer lies in understanding that they are measuring different things about the same property and that both measurements are accurate. The broadcast ratings measure the live scheduled viewing audience, the people who tuned in to Fox on a specific night at a specific time to watch the show as part of their regular broadcast television habit. That audience has declined because the behavior of watching broadcast television on a schedule has declined as a general practice in American media consumption, and older shows that built their audiences on that practice have seen their broadcast numbers fall as the people who formed those habits have migrated towards streaming. This is not specific to Family Guy. It is a structural industry trend affecting almost every broadcast program. The streaming numbers measure a completely different audience behavior, the deliberate, self-scheduled, often repeated viewing of specific episodes by people who have sought the show out rather than received it passively through scheduled broadcasting. This audience is substantially larger than the broadcast audience in total accumulated viewing time because it includes the habitual re-watching of favorite episodes by long-term fans, the initial discovery of the complete series by viewers who never watched it during its broadcast run, the casual background viewing of familiar episodes by people doing other things, and the use of the show as sleep-inducing comfort content by a large audience of people who return to it precisely because its predictability and familiarity make it ideal for the specific purpose of providing gentle audio and visual company during the process of falling asleep. The show's total commercial value in 2026 is the sum of both of these stories and of all the other commercial dimensions discussed throughout this script. The broadcast ratings contribute advertising revenue to Fox and licensing revenue to Disney. The streaming viewership contributes subscriber retention and advertising revenue to Hulu and licensing revenue to Disney. The merchandise and licensing programs contribute revenue to Disney across global retail markets. The international distribution contributes revenue to Disney across global broadcasting and streaming markets. The franchise's total commercial value, the $2 to $2.5 billion estimate that encompasses all of these streams, reflects the aggregate of all these contributions rather than the performance of any single one. In this light, the declining broadcast ratings are not evidence that the show is dying. They are evidence that one component of the show's total commercial picture has declined, while other components have grown, and that the overall commercial picture remains strongly positive. The show continues because the math of continuing it is more favorable than the math of ending it, because the total revenue generated across all commercial dimensions continues to exceed the production cost by a comfortable and sustainable margin, and because the corporate entities whose financial interests depend on the show's continued existence are capable of reading that math clearly and acting on it rationally. That is the final accounting. That is the hidden reason, in its fullest and most complete form. The show that refused to die has refused to die because the forces keeping it alive are more powerful, more numerous, and more deeply embedded in the commercial infrastructure of the entertainment industry than any force that might have killed it. The two cancellations did not end it. They created the conditions for a revival that proved those forces to be real. The broadcast ratings did not end it. The streaming numbers revealed the audience that the broadcast ratings had always obscured. The corporate acquisition did not end it. It created a structure of mutual commercial dependency that protects it more securely than any single company arrangement could have. The creative controversies and the critical disappointments and the public falling outs did not end it. None of them were large enough to change the mathematics in the direction of cancellation. The Griffin family is still there because the world built around them, the commercial world and the cultural world and the corporate world, has been unable to afford to let them go. And for the foreseeable future, it will continue to be unable to afford it. The numbers say so. And in the entertainment industry, the numbers win. Extended section. The night it came back, and why that moment changed everything. There is something worth spending time with before this story is fully complete, something that tends to get collapsed into a single sentence in most retellings, but that deserves the specific attention of anyone who wants to truly understand why Family Guy has never been canceled again. That something is the specific quality of the moment when the show came back in May of 2005, what that moment felt like to the people who had been waiting for it, and why the character of that return was itself a form of structural protection that the show carried forward into every season that followed. Television comebacks happen. Shows get canceled and then uncanceled, or they get revived years later with new casts or new creative teams, or they get rebooted with different premises but familiar names. These things happen with varying degrees of success and varying degrees of cultural resonance. But very few television comebacks have felt the way Family Guy's 2005 premiere felt to the people who watched it. The specific emotional texture of that night, the combination of relief and vindication and genuine excitement that attended the return of something that had been wrongly taken away, created a relationship between the show and its audience that was qualitatively different from the relationship most shows build with their viewers through continuous presence rather than absence and return. The 3 years of the show's cancellation had been a period of active maintenance for many of its fans, not a passive waiting but a continuous engagement with the show's existing material. Through the DVD sets and the Adult Swim reruns, and the online communities where the show was discussed and argued about and kept alive as a cultural presence, even in the absence of new episodes. This active maintenance transformed what might have been passive viewership into something closer to invested fandom, the specific kind of relationship with a creative work that is characterized by the sense of personal stake that comes from having fought for something's survival and seen it rewarded. When the 4th season premiered on the 1st of May 2005, with an episode called North by North Quahog, the people watching it were not simply watching a new episode of a show they liked. They were experiencing the fulfillment of something they had worked for, the specific pleasure that comes from an outcome that required effort to achieve. The 11 million plus viewers who watched that premiere included millions of people who had purchased DVD sets, who had watched Adult Swim at midnight, who had argued the show's case in online forums, who had written emails to Fox or signed petitions or simply told other people that this show was worth watching and that it was wrong that it had been canceled. Their collective action, expressed through the commercial channels of DVD purchasing and the social channels of fan advocacy, had contributed to the outcome they were now witnessing. They had a stake in the show's return that went beyond the ordinary relationship between a viewer and a program. This stakeholder quality of the show's post-revival fanbase has been one of the primary sources of its commercial durability in the years since. People who feel ownership over a show's survival do not abandon it lightly. They bring to it a loyalty that is specifically calibrated to the experience of having been without it, of having known what it was like when it was gone and having worked to bring it back. That loyalty is not unconditional, and it does not prevent fans from acknowledging the show's later limitations. But it does provide a floor of continued engagement that passive viewers of shows that have never been canceled do not provide, a stubborn persistence of interest that survives creative disappointments that would drive away a less invested audience. The online communities that had formed around Family Guy during its cancellation years were, by the standards of 2003 and 2004, early examples of the kind of organized, creative, commercially influential fan communities that have become a defining feature of the contemporary entertainment landscape. The fans who gathered in those communities to discuss the show, share clips from the DVD sets, analyze episodes, and advocate for the revival were doing something that had rarely been done before in quite the same way, using the internet's capacity for community formation around a shared interest to build an infrastructure of fandom that extended well beyond what any individual fan could have achieved in isolation. This infrastructure did not disappear when the show came back. It evolved and expanded, developing the specific character of the fan communities that have sustained the show's cultural presence across the decades since the revival. The 2005 comeback also established a pattern for how the show's corporate stewards thought about it going forward, a pattern that has been consistently reproduced in every subsequent renewal decision. The lesson of the cancellations was not just that the show had a commercially viable audience, it was that the show had an audience that would express its commercial value through channels that the standard measurement tools might not immediately capture, that the true commercial significance of the property might only become fully apparent when it was absent from the market, and the audience's response to that absence could be measured in the unambiguous language of purchasing decisions. Having learned that lesson once, and at the cost of 3 years of lost production and 3 years of revenues that could have been earned but were not, the network and the studio had strong incentives to protect the property proactively rather than reactively, to maintain it rather than to allow it to be canceled, and then discover once again that the absence created more commercial damage than the presence cost. This learning has been institutionalized in the specific form of the multi-season renewal deals that have characterized the show's post-2005 history. Rather than renewing the show one season at a time and forcing the production to operate under the constant uncertainty that single-season renewals create, the network has committed to multiple seasons in advance, providing the production team with the stability of timeline and resource allocation that allows for more thoughtful, long-range creative planning and that signals to the cast, the writers, and the rest of the production team that the institutional commitment to the show's continuation is genuine and durable. The April 2025 mega deal, committing to 4 seasons simultaneously through the 2028 to 2029 season, is the apotheosis of this pattern, the most explicit and the most long-horizon commitment the network has ever made to the show's continued existence. When you watch Family Guy today, in whatever form and on whatever device, you are watching the product of all of this accumulated institutional learning, the specific relationship between the show and its corporate stewards that was forged in the experience of 2 cancellations and 2 comebacks, and that has produced, over the course of 20-plus years, the specific form of structural protection that the show now enjoys. The protection is not the result of anyone loving the show unconditionally or of any executive having a personal commitment to its continuation that transcends commercial calculation. It is the result of hard experience teaching the relevant parties, repeatedly and expensively, that this specific property generates commercial value in ways that are not always visible in the metrics most routinely consulted, and that the appropriate response to that lesson is to protect the property rather than to test it. Extended section: The Sleep Content Revolution and Why Family Guy Owns the Night. There is a specific form of media consumption that has emerged as one of the defining behaviors of the streaming era, one that was essentially impossible before the combination of smartphones, wireless internet, and unlimited content streaming services created the technical and economic conditions for it: the practice of falling asleep to television. Not watching television before sleep, which has been common for decades, but specifically using television as sleep-inducing background content, allowing episodes to play continuously while the viewer transitions from wakefulness to sleep and then through sleep, with the audio serving as a kind of ambient soundtrack to the unconscious hours. This practice is widespread in a way that most discourse about television consumption does not adequately acknowledge. Sleep-related content consumption, whether through television episodes played on a loop or through the dedicated sleep podcast and YouTube channel category that has developed explicitly around this use case, represents an enormous number of media hours that are consumed in ways that have no precise precedent in the history of broadcast television, and that the traditional ratings measurement systems were never designed to capture. People fall asleep to The Office and Friends and Bob's Burgers and Brooklyn Nine-Nine and dozens of other shows that have developed reputations for being ideal sleep content, safe and familiar and gentle enough in their pacing to allow the mind to release its daytime vigilance without being replaced by something too demanding or too strange. Family Guy has developed a specific reputation as sleep content, and the specific qualities that make it work for this purpose are worth examining carefully because they reveal something about the show that is rarely discussed in the context of its cultural and commercial value. The show is, in a carefully calibrated way, safe. Not safe in the sense of being inoffensive, which it manifestly is not, but safe in the sense of being predictable in its structure, familiar in its characters, and consistent in the specific kind of comedy it delivers. You know, when you put on Family Guy as sleep content, that what is going to follow will not suddenly shift into something disturbing or demanding or emotionally threatening. The characters will be the same characters. The situations will be variations on familiar situations. The jokes will arrive in the familiar rhythm of setup and punchline and cutaway and return over and over, episode after episode, as reliable and as consistent as the sound of rain or the hum of a fan. This predictability, which is sometimes framed as a creative limitation of the later seasons, is in the context of sleep content a genuine feature rather than a bug. Sleep content works by providing enough stimulation to distract the conscious mind from the anxieties and ruminations that interfere with sleep, without providing enough stimulation to engage the conscious mind fully and prevent sleep from days. Arriving. The specific calibration of Family Guy's comedy, familiar enough to require no interpretive effort but varied enough episode to prevent the mind from becoming bored and returning to the thoughts it was trying to escape, places it in a remarkably useful position for this specific purpose. The show's pacing is also relevant to its sleep content value. Family Guy episodes, particularly in the later seasons, move at a pace that is gentle enough to be restful without being so slow that it creates the kind of restless attention that comes from waiting for something to happen. The cutaway gag format creates a rhythm of brief comic moments and returns to the main narrative that functions almost like a breathing pattern, a regular alternation between stimulation and relative quiet that the body's sleep systems can work alongside rather than against. The show does not build toward dramatic climaxes that would jolt the viewer back to full wakefulness at the worst moment. It maintains a consistent emotional temperature that is slightly above neutral but never threatening. Nielsen's measurement of streaming viewership, which counts viewing time on television screens and excludes viewing on computers and mobile devices, almost certainly significantly undercounts Family Guy's total streaming audience, because a substantial portion of the sleep content viewing happens on phones and tablets placed beside beds rather than on television screens. The 42 billion minutes measured by Nielsen in 2024 is, in all probability, a lower bound on the actual total, with unmeasured device viewing adding an unknown but potentially very substantial additional quantity of engagement. The show's true total audience in the streaming era may be even larger than the already extraordinary measured numbers suggest. This dimension of Family Guy's audience relationship, the sleep content dimension, has no direct commercial parallel in the show's original broadcast life. You could not fall asleep to Family Guy when it aired on Fox on Tuesday nights at 8:30 against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Because it was on for one episode per week at a specific time, and then it was gone until the following week. The infinite back catalog available on streaming, combined with the autoplay function that continues playing episodes without requiring any action from the viewer, is what makes this form of engagement possible at the scale it currently operates. The streaming availability of 400 episodes, playable continuously in any order at any hour, transformed the show from a weekly scheduled event into an ambient presence that can be turned on at any moment and that will continue playing as long as the viewer wants it to. The commercial implications of this transformation extend beyond the streaming numbers themselves to the specific quality of the relationship between the show and its sleep content audience. People who fall asleep to Family Guy multiple times per week develop a relationship with the show's characters and its world that is continuous and habitual in ways that even the most devoted conventional viewer does not experience. The show is literally present in their bedroom, a constant companion of their most private and most vulnerable hours. The familiarity and the comfort that the show provides in those hours creates a form of brand loyalty that is intimate in a way that no other entertainment experience precisely replicates. This is, finally, one of the most compelling and most unusual aspects of Family Guy's current cultural and commercial position. A show that was canceled twice in its first few years, that was never supposed to survive, that has been publicly ambivalently held by its own creator, that has been criticized for the better part of 2 decades by critics who prefer what it was to what it has become, is now keeping company with millions of people in their beds every night as they fall asleep. It is the last voice they hear before the day releases them. It is the familiar sound of characters they have known for years, telling jokes they may have heard before, in a world they know well, providing the specific gift of comfortable presence that the best companion of any kind provides. Not the excitement of the new, but the deeper pleasure of the reliably known. That is where Family Guy lives in 2026. Not at the peak of its creative powers, perhaps. Not at the center of the critical conversation about what television should be, but in the quiet of bedrooms and living rooms, in the soft light of phones and tablets, in the habitual comfort of millions of people who choose it specifically and deliberately from among every other option available to them, and who choose it for reasons that are both simple and profound. Because they know it, because it does not ask too much of them, because it is there. Those reasons are not the reasons anyone imagined when the show was being planned and pitched in 1998. But they are real reasons, and they generate real commercial value, and they are the most honest expression of what this specific property, in this specific moment in its long and improbable history, actually is and means to the people who keep returning to it. The story of why Family Guy has never been canceled again ends, as all the best stories do, not with the explanation of a single mystery, but with the revelation of a complexity that the simple version of the story could not contain. It ends with the understanding that there is no single reason, no silver bullet explanation, no one factor that accounts for the whole remarkable fact of this show's survival. There is instead a constellation of reasons, each real and each important, and each reinforcing the others in ways that make the total more durable than any individual element could be alone. The economics of animation, the streaming revolution, the corporate architecture of mutual dependency, the cast's extraordinary loyalty, the cultural permanence accumulated across 25 years of continuous presence. The sleep content relationship that puts the show in the most intimate space in millions of people's lives every night. The institutional memory of what cancellation cost, held by the people with the power to prevent it from happening again. All of these things together constitute the hidden reason. And now, having heard all of them in their full complexity and their full detail, you understand something about the entertainment industry that most people who watch television from the outside never have occasion to understand. That shows do not survive because they are good, or because people love them, or because their creators are passionate about continuing them. They survive because the commercial logic of continuing them is stronger than the commercial logic of ending them, and because that logic, once established at the scale that Family Guy has established it, is among the most durable forces in the entertainment industry. The Griffin family is still there because the world built around them cannot afford to let them go. And it will not let them go for as long as that world continues to exist in the form it currently takes. Extended section. The animation domination block. How a lineup became a fortress. One of the structural features of Family Guy's post-revival existence that rarely receives the analytical attention it deserves is the specific value of being part of Fox's animation domination block, a programming strategy that has protected the show in ways that go well beyond the obvious benefit of a stable time slot. Animation domination is not merely a branding exercise. It is a mutually reinforcing commercial ecosystem in which each show's presence strengthens the others and in which the departure of any single show would create disruptions that extend far beyond the simple loss of that show's individual audience. When Family Guy returned in 2005, it joined a block that included The Simpsons, King of the Hill, and The New American Dad. The logic of programming animated comedies together in a single block had been demonstrated by The Simpsons' decades of success as a Sunday night anchor, but the expansion of that block into a full evening of animation was a strategic escalation that changed the commercial value of the arrangement significantly. Viewers who tuned in for The Simpsons at 7:30 were likely to remain through the 8 o'clock slot and into the 9 o'clock slot if the programming maintained sufficient quality and variety to justify continued viewing. The block created a viewing session rather than individual appointment viewing, and a viewing session is commercially more valuable than an individual appointment because it accumulates more advertising impressions per viewer across the evening. For Family Guy specifically, the block provided something it had never had during its troubled first run: a ready-made flow of animation-minded viewers arriving from a preceding show. The audience that watched The Simpsons in the 8 o'clock slot was the exact demographic that Family Guy was designed to appeal to: adult viewers with an interest in animated comedy, and the probability that some percentage of that audience would remain watching when Family Guy came on at 9 was meaningfully higher than the probability that a random broadcast audience would tune into a show they had not specifically scheduled to watch. The block created a passive discovery mechanism that supplemented the active scheduling habit of dedicated Family Guy viewers, providing a continuous supply of new potential fans who found the show through the block structure rather than through deliberate seeking. Over the years, the specific composition of the animation domination block has changed. King of the Hill ended its original run in 2010 after 13 seasons. Cleveland Show, the Family Guy spinoff following the supporting character Cleveland Brown, as he relocated to Virginia, ran from 2009 to 2013 before ending. Bob's Burgers arrived in 2011 and has been one of the block's most critically acclaimed and most reliably enjoyable components ever since. American Dad moved to TBS in 2014, returning to Fox in 2025 as part of the mega deal. The block has evolved continuously, but has maintained its fundamental character as a coherent and complementary evening of animated comedy programming. The block's commercial logic has evolved alongside the streaming revolution in ways that have actually strengthened it relative to the traditional broadcast model. When viewers watch the animation domination block on Fox's broadcast feed, they are consuming advertising in a live or near-live context that is among the most commercially valuable for advertisers, because it is one of the few remaining forms of guaranteed contemporaneous viewership. The viewers who watch animation domination are watching on Sunday night in real time, which means the advertising they see is current and relevant in a way that time-shifted viewing does not guarantee. Fox can charge premium advertising rates for this live audience, and those premium rates make the block commercially valuable to the network, even at audience sizes that would be considered inadequate for comparable live-action programming. The April 2025 mega deal that renewed Family Guy through season 27 was simultaneously a renewal of The Simpsons through season 40, a renewal of Bob's Burgers through season 19, and a renewal of American Dad through season 23. The bundled nature of the deal reveals something important about how the animation domination block functions as a commercial unit. Fox and Disney were not negotiating each show individually and arriving at separate decisions about each one. They were negotiating the block as a whole, treating the 4 shows as components of a single commercial arrangement whose value was partly the sum of the individual show's values and partly something additional, an emergent commercial value that comes from the shows being programmed together and from the specific reputation for reliable quality animated comedy that the block has built over more than 2 decades. This block-level value protection is one of the less visible but genuinely important mechanisms that keeps Family Guy in production. Even if Family Guy's individual commercial metrics were insufficient to justify its renewal on a standalone basis, which they are not, its role as a component of the block would provide additional commercial justification that the standalone metrics do not capture. The block needs its anchor shows to maintain the coherent identity that makes it commercially reliable, and Family Guy has been one of those anchor shows since its return in 2005. Its removal would create not just a gap to be filled, but a disruption to the block's commercial identity that would require more than a simple replacement to address. The block also creates a competitive moat around its component shows by making it harder for other networks to assemble comparable programming. The animation audience is not infinite, and the audience for adult animated comedy in particular is a specific and somewhat specialized demographic. By assembling 4 well-established, consistently performing animated comedies in a single evening on a single network, Fox has built a programming position that any competitor trying to develop a rival animation block would have to overcome by starting from scratch with shows that have no established audience and no accumulated cultural presence. The competitive advantage of the existing show's cumulative decades of audience building is an asset that cannot be replicated quickly or cheaply, and it is an asset that benefits every show in the block, including Family Guy. Extended section. What happens after Season 27, Reading the Future, the April 2025 mega deal commits to Family Guy through Season 27 and the 2028 to 2029 television season. What happens after that? The question is not answerable with certainty from the present vantage point, but it is worth examining because the factors that would determine the answer are already visible and provide a reasonable basis for informed speculation about the show's trajectory beyond the current renewal horizon. The commercial fundamentals that would need to change to make cancellation after Season 27 more attractive than renewal are relatively well defined. The streaming viewership would need to decline substantially and consistently, suggesting that the comfort viewing and discovery viewing behaviors that have driven the extraordinary streaming numbers are eroding rather than being maintained or expanded. The merchandise and licensing revenues would need to contract significantly, suggesting that the intellectual property is losing the cultural relevance that makes branded products commercially viable in retail environments. The international distribution deals would need to become less valuable, suggesting that the show's global appeal is diminishing as new audiences in expanding streaming markets are reached, and the pool of undiscovered potential viewers shrinks. And the production economics would need to change in ways that make the cost of continuing less favorable relative to the revenue generated. None of these things are impossible, and all of them will eventually happen as the show ages further, and the generational transmission mechanisms that have sustained its audience renewal eventually reach their limits. But none of them appear to be happening at a rate that would make Season 28 and beyond commercially irrational. The streaming numbers from 2024 and 2025 are not declining. The international market for the show is growing rather than shrinking as streaming services expand their global reach. The merchandise ecosystem, anchored by the mobile game and the continuing presence of the intellectual property in global retail, is active and generating ongoing revenue. The production economics have been stable for years, with no signs of the kind of cost escalation that would fundamentally change the commercial equation. Seth MacFarlane has said that the show will continue as long as people want it. This is both a genuine expression of his own ambivalence about its continuation and an accurate description of the commercial logic that governs the renewal decisions. The people who want the show, measured by the 42 billion streaming minutes and the Nielsen streaming top 10 appearances and the merchandise sales and the TikTok views, are currently very numerous. They are numerous enough that the people who make the renewal decisions continue to see renewal as the rational choice. When that changes, when the evidence of continuing desire for the show becomes insufficient to justify the cost of meeting that desire, the show will end. Not before. The show's 30th anniversary, which falls in January 2029, is a marketing and commercial milestone that will itself generate attention and renewed interest in the property in ways that create additional commercial value from the simple fact of the milestone's arrival. 30th anniversaries of cultural landmarks are occasions for retrospectives and reassessments and anniversary content, and the specific nostalgic attention of an audience that grew up with the property being celebrated. The streaming performance in the anniversary year, 2029, will likely benefit from the additional attention that anniversary coverage generates, providing renewed evidence of the show's continued cultural relevance that will itself be cited as justification for whatever renewal discussions follow the conclusion of the current deal. The show has, in other words, a specific commercial momentum that carries it forward beyond the current horizon, a momentum built from the accumulation of 25-plus years of commercial operations and cultural presence that creates its own future evidence of viability. Each year of the show's continued existence adds to the library that generates streaming revenue. Each year of the show's continued cultural relevance adds to the merchandise and licensing ecosystem. Each year of the show's continued broadcast presence adds to the institutional knowledge and the competitive moat that the animation domination block represents. The momentum is real and it is durable, and it is the final form of the commercial protection that keeps Family Guy alive. The Griffin family will reach their 30th anniversary, still making new episodes and still drawing audiences on every platform available. That is not in doubt. What comes after that anniversary? Whether the show finds a way to sustain the commercial case for another decade or whether the 30th season becomes the last, depends on forces that are currently in motion but not yet determinative. What is determinative right now is that the case for the show's survival has never been as structurally secure as it is in the spring of 2026, and that the hidden reasons for that security are exactly what this script has spent its full length explaining. The story of Family Guy is not over. It is, if anything, entering a phase of institutional permanence that its earliest years could not have predicted and its most difficult years could not have guaranteed. The show that was canceled twice and brought back by fan loyalty and DVD sales and late-night cable reruns has become something that the entertainment industry's own commercial machinery has made essentially impossible to cancel, not out of love or obligation, but out of the cold and reliable logic of numbers that consistently favor its existence over its absence. That is the hidden reason. That, in its full complexity and its full detail and its full honesty, is why Family Guy has never been canceled again. Rest well. And if you are still here, still listening in the quiet of whatever hour this finds you, know that you have spent your time with something worth the spending. The next one will be waiting. Extended section. The spin-off strategy, how Family Guy created its own ecosystem. One of the most underappreciated dimensions of Family Guy's commercial longevity is the degree to which it has generated an entire ecosystem of related content, branching intellectual property, and spin-off programming that has simultaneously expanded the franchise's commercial footprint and created additional protective value for the original show by demonstrating the depth and fertility of the creative world McFarlane established. Understanding this spin-off ecosystem is important not just as a commercial footnote, but as evidence of a creative universe rich enough to sustain multiple separate productions, which itself speaks to the foundational strength of what McFarlane built in those original seasons. The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013 on Fox, was the first major spin-off from the Family Guy universe. It followed Cleveland Brown, the quiet, patient neighbor who had been one of the 4 core members of Peter Griffin's social circle since the show's earliest seasons, as he left his hometown to relocate to Stoolbend, Virginia, where he reconnected with a childhood sweetheart and inherited a ready-made new family. The show ran for 4 seasons and produced 93 episodes, establishing its own cast of characters and its own specific comedic identity, while maintaining clear stylistic and character connections to the show that spawned it. The Cleveland Show's moderate but consistent commercial performance demonstrated something important about the Family Guy intellectual property's depth, that its secondary characters were developed fully enough to sustain their own narratives, that the world McFarlane had built was large enough to contain stories that did not require Peter Griffin at their center. This depth is commercially significant because it suggests that the Family Guy universe is a genuine fictional world rather than merely a collection of jokes assembled around a single central character, a world with enough internal coherence and enough character richness to be explored from multiple entry points and in multiple forms. American Dad, while not technically a spin-off from Family Guy in that it features entirely original characters in a different setting, is most accurately understood as a creative sibling, a companion piece that McFarlane developed during the Family Guy cancellation years, and that shares the same creative DNA while making deliberately different structural choices. American Dad's decision to forego the cutaway gag format in favor of story-driven episode structures was a direct creative response to the criticism that Family Guy's format had attracted, an attempt to demonstrate that McFarlane and his collaborators could sustain a full half-hour narrative without the modularity of cutaway humor. The fact that American Dad went on to produce episodes that many critics and fans consider to have eventually surpassed Family Guy in consistent creative quality is itself evidence of the fertility of the creative ground that Family Guy originally cultivated. The creative symbiosis between Family Guy and American Dad has been commercially valuable in ways that extend beyond the individual performance of each show. Having two successful animated comedies from the same creative family airing on the same network on the same night creates a mutually reinforcing critical mass of animated comedy content that benefits both shows by giving the animation domination block the depth and variety it needs to maintain. Viewer engagement across a full evening of programming. The viewer who enjoys Family Guy but finds its cutaway-heavy structure occasionally frustrating has American Dad as an immediate alternative that provides a different experience of essentially the same creative sensibility. The viewer who appreciates American Dad's narrative coherence but wants the pure anarchic energy of the cutaway format has Family Guy immediately adjacent. The block serves both needs simultaneously. The Seth MacFarlane creative universe has extended further still with The Orville, the science fiction series that MacFarlane created and stars in as a live-action project developed initially for Fox and then moved to Hulu. The Orville is entirely separate from the animated comedy world of Family Guy and American Dad in its genre and its format, but it draws on the same deep pool of MacFarlane's creative obsessions, his love for classic science fiction television, particularly of the Star Trek variety, and his specific narrative sensibility that combines earnest emotional engagement with sharp humor. The Orville's existence as a successful, separate creative identity for MacFarlane beyond the animated comedies demonstrates that his creative world is genuinely expansive rather than limited to a single comedic register. For Family Guy specifically, the existence of MacFarlane's broader creative portfolio is commercially valuable in a specific way. It reduces the risk that the institutional knowledge and the creative leadership concentrated in the MacFarlane Creative Organization will be lost to the animated comedy ecosystem through simple attrition or creative exhaustion. MacFarlane has the outlet of The Orville and his music career and his various film projects to pursue the creative ambitions that cannot be fulfilled within the specific format of Family Guy. This diversification of his creative activity means that Family Guy is not the only vessel for his creative energy and is therefore not subject to the specific burnout risk that comes from forcing a single creator to channel all of their creative impulse into a single long-running property. He can give Family Guy what it needs from him, the voice performances and the executive oversight and the brand identity, while pursuing other things that satisfy the creative ambitions that Family Guy cannot contain. The Ted franchise, which MacFarlane created for film and then developed into a live-action television prequel series on Peacock, adds another dimension to the ecosystem. The Ted films grossed over $1 billion at the global box office across their two theatrical releases, demonstrating that MacFarlane's specific comedic sensibility had a live-action commercial viability that the film industry had not previously confirmed at that scale. The Ted television series for Peacock, which premiered in 2024, extended the franchise into ongoing television and represented yet another form of MacFarlane commercial productivity that contributed to the institutional infrastructure surrounding Family Guy without being part of Family Guy itself. All of this activity within the MacFarlane creative universe contributes to the commercial ecosystem surrounding Family Guy by ensuring that the institutional structures that support its production, the production company, the creative relationships, the executive leadership, remain active and commercially significant even as Family Guy itself represents a diminishing fraction of MacFarlane's total creative output. The show is no longer the sole center of a creative universe, but one planet in a solar system that extends considerably beyond it. And the health of that solar system is itself a form of protection for the original show. Extended section: The return of Adult Swim and what it means. In January of 2025, Family Guy returned to Adult Swim. The return was announced in late 2024 and launched with a 3-day marathon of library episodes on New Year's Day, followed by a weeknight programming slot that placed Family Guy back in the late-night cable environment that had been so crucial to its revival in 2003. The return was not a simple repetition of the 2003 scenario. It occurred under different conditions, for different commercial reasons, and with different implications for the show's trajectory. The 2003 Adult Swim deal had been motivated by the Cartoon Network's need to fill its late-night block with affordable content and by the availability of Family Guy's library episodes at a price that reflected the show's then negligible commercial value following 2 cancellations. The 2025 return was motivated by different forces on both sides. Adult Swim, now part of the Warner Brothers. Discovery portfolio following the merger of Warner Media and Discovery was looking to strengthen its late-night programming with recognizable branded content that could attract the late-night cable audience that still existed and that valued the Adult Swim brand identity. Family Guy, now owned by Disney and with its library exclusively available on Hulu in the streaming market, was available for a non-exclusive licensing deal that allowed it to appear on Adult Swim without conflicting with the Hulu streaming arrangement. The non-exclusive nature of the 2025 Adult Swim deal reflects the evolved commercial sophistication of the entertainment industry's approach to content licensing. In 2003, the concept of non-exclusive library licensing across multiple platforms was not part of the industry's standard operating vocabulary. Shows were typically placed exclusively with a single distributor for a defined period, and the idea of the same content being available on multiple platforms simultaneously would have seemed commercially inefficient. By 2025, the industry had fully absorbed the understanding that content availability across multiple platforms is not inherently cannibalistic, that people who watch Family Guy on Adult Swim late at night may also have Hulu subscriptions and may watch the show in different modes on different platforms for different purposes. The Adult Swim viewing and the Hulu streaming are not competing for the same viewer moment. They are serving different viewing needs of an audience that has multiple consumption modes available simultaneously. The return to Adult Swim closed a loop that the show's history had opened in 2003 when a version of the channel that barely existed yet had given a canceled show a home that nobody expected to matter, and that turned out to change the trajectory of the entire entertainment industry. The 2025 return acknowledged that history and built on it, treating Adult Swim not as a rescue venue but as a continuing commercial partner in the show's multi-platform existence, a late-night home that serves a specific segment of the show's audience in a specific way that complements rather than competes with the show's other distribution channels. The Adult Swim return also demonstrated something about the show's cultural resilience that the streaming numbers, while informative, do not capture with the same qualitative precision. The decision by Adult Swim to license Family Guy for a return engagement in 2025 reflected an institutional judgment that the show's presence would strengthen the Adult Swim brand by association rather than diluting it. Adult Swim's brand identity, built around smart, slightly transgressive, late-night animation for adults who stay up late and want something other than conventional entertainment, is served by association with Family Guy in a way that reflects the show's continued cultural relevance to the specific audience that makes Adult Swim's identity meaningful. The channel would not have pursued the licensing deal if it believed Family Guy was commercially exhausted or culturally irrelevant. Its pursuit of the deal is itself evidence of the show's continued brand value in exactly the environment where that value was first established. For the show's long-term story, the Adult Swim return is another data point in the consistent pattern that has characterized Family Guy's commercial history since 2003. Every time the show's continued relevance might seem to be in question, the commercial actions of the parties involved in its distribution and exhibition consistently demonstrate that the question is not as pressing as the critics and the declining broadcast ratings suggest. The commercial actors who make real decisions about real money consistently bet on the show's continued value, and their bets have consistently been vindicated. The Adult Swim return is the most recent instance of this pattern, and it is unlikely to be the last. Extended section: The legacy of the Super Bowl launch and why first impressions echo forever. There is one final aspect of Family Guy's story that deserves to be examined before this long account reaches its close, and it is an aspect that sits at the very beginning rather than at the contemporary moment. The show's premiere on the 31st of January 1999, immediately following Fox's broadcast of Super Bowl 33, was not merely a fortunate scheduling decision. It was a foundational event whose commercial and cultural consequences have echoed through every year of the show's existence and continue to shape its institutional position today. The Super Bowl is, by a significant margin, the most watched single television broadcast in American life. It consistently draws audiences of 100 million or more viewers, a number that dwarfs the viewership of any other annual programming event, and that represents the closest thing the fragmented contemporary media landscape has to a genuinely universal shared viewing experience. The specific time slot immediately following the Super Bowl game is consequently the most coveted post-game positioning in American broadcast television, a slot that delivers to whatever program occupies it a massive, captive, and demographically diverse audience that has already been settled in front of their television sets for several hours, and that is predisposed by the social and commercial rituals surrounding the event to continue watching through the immediate aftermath. Fox's decision to place Family Guy in this slot was a vote of institutional confidence that the show's creator, the voice cast, the writers, and the production team were building something worth presenting to the largest possible audience at the first available opportunity. That decision, and the 22 million viewers it produced for the show's premiere episode, established Family Guy in the public consciousness at a scale and with an immediacy that most shows never achieve, even across multiple seasons of sustained strong performance. The premiere audience of 22 million people did not all become devoted fans. But they all had a first encounter with the show, a moment of initial exposure that lodged the characters and the specific comedic sensibility in their awareness in ways that subsequent viewings, chance encounters with clips, and the ambient cultural presence of the show could build upon. The cultural weight of that premiere has not dissipated across 25 years. It sits in the background of every conversation about the show as a marker of what the show was capable of at its launch, and as a reference point for the specific quality of the commercial relationship between the show and its corporate parent that existed from the very beginning. Fox gave Family Guy the Super Bowl slot. Fox then canceled it twice. The gap between those two facts tells you something important about the institutional dysfunction that the cancellations represented, the specific failure to honor the commitment implied by the Super Bowl launch, and it makes the subsequent protections and multi-season renewals feel like an institutional reckoning with that earlier failure. The Super Bowl premiere also established a commercial baseline against which all subsequent performance was measured, and that baseline was so high that any normal performance looked like decline. A show that premieres to 22 million viewers and then settles into a normal audience of 8 to 12 million is not failing. It is performing exactly as any show that received a Super Bowl lead-in platform would be expected to perform. The launch audience created by the Super Bowl slot is almost always inflated beyond the show's natural audience because it includes millions of viewers who watched out of inertia or curiosity rather than genuine interest, viewers who would not return the following week regardless of how good the premiere was. The 7 to 9 million viewers who became the show's consistent core in its better broadcast years were not a diminished audience. They were the real audience, the people who had been given the Super Bowl opportunity to find the show and had decided to return. Understanding the Super Bowl premiere in these terms helps explain why the decline from 22 million to 8 million was not and should not have been treated as evidence of the show's commercial failure. It was evidence of the show finding its natural audience after an inflated introduction, which is exactly what happens to every show that receives an exceptional premiere platform. The network's failure to maintain this context across the scheduling decisions that followed the premiere was the institutional dysfunction that led to the first cancellation, and recognizing it as dysfunction rather than as evidence of genuine audience rejection is essential to understanding the full arc of the show's history. The legacy of the Super Bowl launch lives in the institutional memory of the entertainment industry as a data point about what Family Guy can attract when it is given the right platform, and it has influenced every subsequent commercial assessment of the show's ceiling. When Disney and Fox negotiate licensing fees and renewal deals, the knowledge that this show once attracted 22 million viewers for a single episode is part of the background context, a reminder of the property's demonstrated capacity for mass appeal that reinforces the commercial case for maintaining its production and its broadcast presence. The premiere was not just a first episode. It was a proof of concept that the show has been citing, in various commercial contexts, for 25 years. The 30th anniversary in 2029 will be an occasion for revisiting the Super Bowl premiere story in the specific way that significant anniversaries always revisit origin stories, with the benefit of hindsight that 25 years provides, and with the specific poignancy of a story whose outcome, the show's permanent survival, was anything but obvious from the vantage point of January 1999. The 22 million people who watched that premiere could not have known that the show they were watching would still be in production 3 decades later, still voiced by the same people, still airing on the same network, still drawing audiences in forms and through channels that did not exist when the premiere aired. The distance between where the show was on that January night and where it is today is the distance of the whole improbable story told in this script, and it is a distance worth marking when the 30th anniversary arrives. In the meantime, the show goes on. The recording sessions continue. The writer's room continues. The animation studios in Los Angeles and overseas continue processing the storyboards and layouts that will become the episodes of seasons 24 and 25 and 26 and 27, the guaranteed content of the most recent renewal period. The streaming numbers accumulate, day by day and week by week and month by month, adding to the 42 billion minutes and the 60 billion minutes and whatever the number will be when the next annual report is published. And the data reveals once again that this show is one of the most watched programs in the world. The Griffins are still there? They have always been there, through the cancellations and the revivals and the corporate acquisitions and the format revolutions and the cultural shifts that have remade the entertainment landscape around them while leaving them recognizably themselves. Peter and Lois and Meg and Chris and Stewie and Brian, occupying the same house in the same fictional Rhode Island town, telling the same kinds of stories in the same distinctive voice, still making people laugh, and still making people reach for their phones to queue up the next episode before the current one ends? That is the hidden reason Family Guy has never been canceled again. Not one reason, but all of them, together and simultaneously, and reinforcing each other so thoroughly that the question of whether to cancel the show has become, in practical terms, genuinely unanswerable in the affirmative. The commercial logic says, continue. The cultural logic says, continue. The corporate logic says, continue. The institutional memory says, continue. The audience, measured in billions of streaming minutes and millions of merchandise purchases and tens of billions of TikTok views, says continue. And so it continues.